War makes widows. Peace makes brides. For centuries, queens have been the bargaining chips in games played with crowns and swords, married not for love, but to the very men who once burned their cities, killed their kin, or signed their death warrants. These are the women who walked down aisles lined with former enemies, wearing silk over scar tissue, their vows sealing treaties written in blood. Tonight, we follow 30 such queens, 30 uneasy smiles at the edge of history, to see what happens when you sleep beside the person your people once swore to destroy. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the rest of our late-night history hunts. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is on your clock right now. I want to know who else is awake for this. Anne of Brittany. Anne was 15 when she learned that kingdoms could swallow people whole, not just land. The Duchy of Brittany had been her inheritance: stone-walled towns, wind-blown coasts, a stubborn people who were happiest when resenting outsiders. France was the outsider in question. For years, the French crown had been edging closer, sending soldiers and smiles in equal measure, as if conquest were merely courtship with sharper teeth. Brittany resisted. Anne resisted harder. She was crowned Duchess in 1,489-inch reign, the ceremony feeling less like a coronation and more like the beginning of a siege. The war was ugly. Not the clean kind with banners and honour, but the slow suffocation of blockades, betrayal by supposed allies, and a steady drain of silver and willpower. The young Duchess tried the usual medieval tricks: alliances through marriage. First, a contract with Maximilian of Austria, Holy Roman Emperor-to-be. It was a smart move. The empire was a natural counterweight to France, but smart didn't matter when you were trapped. Charles VIII of France simply marched in, declared the betrothal invalid under French law, and left her with a choice that wasn't a choice at all. Marry him, or watch Brittany vanish under the French crown like a coastline at high tide. The wedding in 1491 was not the stuff of fairy tales, though the court poets worked hard to pretend otherwise. Imagine the young Duchess, forced into a gown that glittered in candlelight, while knowing every stitch was sewn from the fabric of her surrender. She was not just marrying Charles VIII. She was marrying the man who had defeated her, absorbed her duchy, and clipped her political wings. She smiled for the portraits. What else could she do? History would remember her as the twice Queen of France, but Brittany would remember her as the Duchess who had no choice. Charles VIII himself seemed almost embarrassed by the circumstances. Not enough to undo them. Of course, power is the most forgiving of opiates, but enough to treat Anne with a kind of brittle courtesy. The union was meant to be a symbol of peace between Brittany and France, though in practice it was the peace of a locked door after the last rebel has been dragged out. French administrators moved in. Breton laws and customs bent under the weight of Parisian influence. Anne, who once had ruled in her own right, now signed documents under a French seal. She wasn't passive, though. Anne spent her years at the French court manoeuvring in the only ways left open to her: patronage of the arts, careful cultivation of her Breton identity, and the stubborn insistence on being crowned Duchess of Brittany again after Charles's death. Yes, she managed it twice widowed, twice queen, twice a political survivor. But the war had left its scar. The marriage's irony was as bitter as sea salt. The very act that was supposed to unite Brittany and France was born from war, siege, and the humiliation of a coerced bride. There's an old Breton proverb: better the storm than the calm that follows a wreck. Anne lived the calm after the wreck, a decorative prize in the French court, her duchy's independence, the price of her hand. Of course, the court chroniclers and propagandists didn't write it that way. They wrote of love blooming between conqueror and conquered, of divine providence guiding the two crowns together. But if you read the letters, the contracts, the little legal footnotes, you see the truth. The union was transactional, not romantic. Charles VIII didn't need Anne's affection. He needed her signature. And she gave it, with the same grace a prisoner signs their release papers when they know the release is into a larger prison. Anne's life became a series of calculated concessions. She bore children who would inherit both crowns. She attended tournaments and feasts that celebrated the same monarchy that had ended her people's independence. She watched as French nobility acquired lands in Brittany, their names replacing old Breton ones on maps. Yet, in private, she commissioned manuscripts in the Breton language, preserved her duchy's heraldry, and made sure her burial would be in Nantes, the heart of Brittany. Symbolic resistance, but resistance all the same. It's tempting to imagine an alternate history, one where Maximilian's marriage contract held, where Brittany stayed a stubborn outpost of independence on the edge of France. But history rarely favors the stubborn when the enemy is bigger, richer, and already inside your gates. Anne's wedding wasn't the romantic blending of two realms, it was the quiet signing of an armistice where only one side kept its weapons. And yet, there's something haunting about the way she carried herself afterward. She didn't openly rebel, didn't try to spark another war. She played the long game, securing concessions for Brittany wherever she could. Maybe she knew that survival sometimes wears the mask of surrender. Or maybe she simply understood that the French court was another kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were smiles and silks instead of swords. History calls her the last independent ruler of Brittany. But independence doesn't vanish with a signature. It lingers in the way you hold your head, in the language you insist on speaking, in the place you choose to be buried. Anne's headstone in Nantes still bears the arms of Brittany alongside France's lilies, a reminder that even in political defeat, some banners don't come down easily. Which brings us to another queen who found herself in a similar bind, not at the mercy of a foreign invader this time, but trapped in a dynastic blood feud that had split her homeland in two. Elizabeth of York knew what it was like to smile for the marriage portraits, while privately counting the cost of the peace she had just purchased with her own life. Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth's life began in the middle of a family feud that made the Hatfields and McCoys look like neighbours arguing about a fence. The Wars of the Roses were less a single war than a rolling thunderstorm, 30 years of battles, betrayals, and abrupt changes in who was sitting on the English throne. Elizabeth was a Yorkist princess, the daughter of King Edward IV, which should have made her future secure. Instead, it marked her as a piece on the chessboard, one that every player wanted either to protect or remove from the game entirely. Her early years were gilded but precarious. Her father's reign was stable enough on the surface, yet even a child could sense that stability in England was like frost in April, beautiful, but unlikely to last. When Edward IV died in 1483, Elizabeth was 17, and suddenly at the mercy of politics she couldn't control. Her uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, moved swiftly to seize the throne, declaring Elizabeth and her siblings illegitimate. It was a legal fiction, but a very effective one. In a heartbeat, she went from princess to political liability. That same summer, Elizabeth's two younger brothers, the princes in the Tower, disappeared. The whispers said Richard had them killed to remove any Yorkist rivals. Whether she believed it or not, Elizabeth now lived in the dangerous twilight zone of being both royal and powerless. She was valuable precisely because she could be used to legitimize someone else's claim. And one man far from London was already imagining that use. Henry Tudor had spent much of his life in exile, a Lancastrian claimant to the throne, who had been more of a distant rumour than a real threat, until Richard III overreached. In 1485, Henry landed in England with a small army, gambled everything on the Battle of Bosworth, and won. Richard III lay dead in the mud, the crown taken straight from his head and placed on Henry's 7. The new king, Henry VII, knew that winning a battle was only half the job. He had to unite a kingdom exhausted by decades of civil war. The obvious way to cement his victory was to marry the daughter of his enemies. Elizabeth of York was that daughter. By wedding her, Henry could bind the warring houses of Lancaster and York into one new dynasty, the Tudors. In theory, this would end the blood feud forever. In practice, it meant that Elizabeth would be expected to embrace the man who had killed her uncle, defeated her family, and made her a symbol of a unity she had not chosen. The wedding in January 1486 was dressed up as a romance, the union of a handsome king and a beautiful princess. The poets were ecstatic, red rose and white rose intertwined. England healed at last. But the truth had sharper edges. Henry was cautious, almost paranoid, and he made sure that his own claim to the throne was recognized before the marriage took place. The sequence was deliberate. Crown first, bride second. It sent a clear message he was king by right of conquest, not by marriage to a Yorkist. For Elizabeth, the marriage was a study in contrasts. She fulfilled her role with grace, producing children who would embody the Tudor claim. She smiled at public events, served as a model of piety, and became one of the most admired queens in Europe. Yet behind the embroidered gowns, her position was not without shadows. Henry kept her under careful control, limiting her political influence. She was a queen consort, not a power broker like her mother had been. Her private loyalties were a delicate balancing act. She was a Tudor by marriage, but York by blood. When Yorkist plots arose, rebellions fronted by pretenders like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, Elizabeth's own family connections made her both suspect and indispensable. Henry needed her to embody reconciliation, but he never quite stopped seeing her as a potential threat. Even her role as a mother was tinged with politics. Her eldest son, Arthur, was groomed to be the perfect Tudor heir. Her second son, Henry, would become Henry VIII, the man who would later shatter England's relationship with Rome. Her daughters were married off to strengthen alliances, most famously Margaret Tudor, who would wed James IV of Scotland, setting up yet another union between historical enemies. Elizabeth's children were living symbols, each marriage and title calculated to secure the dynasty her own marriage had made possible. There is little direct record of Elizabeth's personal feelings about Henry VII, but the silences in the chronicles speak volumes. She rarely appears as a decisive voice in policy, unlike queens such as Eleanor of Aquitaine or her own mother, Elizabeth Woodville. Instead, she seems to have embodied the Tudor image of serene stability, the perfect political wife. Yet one has to wonder if she ever thought about the cousins and uncles buried in the wars that her marriage was supposed to erase. Henry, for all his reserve, seems to have respected her loyalty. When their eldest son Arthur died suddenly in 1502, the couple's grief is one of the few moments in which their humanity shines through the political fog. They comforted each other in private, a rare glimpse of something personal in a marriage otherwise dominated by public necessity. Elizabeth died just a year later, in 1503, at the age of 37, shortly after giving birth to her last child. Henry reportedly mourned her deeply, withdrawing from court life for weeks. Elizabeth's legacy is complicated. To the Tudors, she was the queen who brought legitimacy and unity. To the Yorkists, she was the daughter who surrendered their claim in exchange for a fragile peace. To history, she's often a quiet figure in the shadow of louder personalities, her ruthless uncle Richard III, her shrewd mother, her iron-willed husband, and her larger-than-life son Henry VIII. But her marriage is one of those moments where the personal and the political are indistinguishable. The end of a war fought in fields and castles, concluded with a kiss at the altar. And yet, was it really an end? The Tudor dynasty would spend the next century defending itself from conspiracies, rebellions, and the lingering ghosts of the roses. Peace, it turns out, is not a thing you win once and keep forever. It's a thing you have to buy over and over, often with other people's lives. Elizabeth knew that from the moment she took Henry's hand. Which brings us to another princess traded across enemy lines, not to end a civil war, but to halt a brutal international conflict. Isabella of Valois would cross the Channel as a child bride, a living pledge that the 100 Years' War might, just might, pause long enough for both sides to catch their breath. Isabella of Valois. She was born into a kingdom that was already tired of fighting, though no one seemed able to stop. Isabella of Valois entered the world in 1389 in the glittering yet brittle court of her father, King Charles VI of France, a man whose reign was marked by moments of splendor interrupted by episodes of madness so profound they left the throne vulnerable to anyone with ambition and a sword. France was still locked in the 100 Years' War with England, a conflict so prolonged and tangled that children were born into it, grew up under it, and died before seeing its end. By the time Isabella was 6, she had already been groomed to understand her role as a pawn in a very large, very bloody game. At court, the whispers about peace were always measured against the price of humiliation. And the price, in this case, was her. The proposal came from across the Channel. Richard II of England, nearly 3 decades her senior, wanted the French princess as his bride. It wasn't the first time such an offer had been floated between Paris and London. Royal marriages were the medieval equivalent of ceasefire agreements. You never trusted them, but you used them when the alternative was bankruptcy and another season of slaughter. The English made their intentions plain. The marriage would be a symbol of reconciliation between two kingdoms that had been battering each other for decades. It would be dressed up as a story of love and union, but underneath it was raw calculation. Richard hoped that by marrying Isabella, he could secure a truce with France that would free him to consolidate his rule at home. For France, marrying off a king's daughter to the enemy was not just a political risk, it was a national humiliation unless it was spun with exquisite care. Charles VI, when lucid, seemed to approve. His uncles and advisers, more interested in survival than sentiment, agreed. And so, in 1396, Isabella, barely out of the nursery, was betrothed to the English king. There is a peculiar kind of cruelty in sending a child to be a political hostage in the silk wrapping of a wedding gown. At 7 years old, Isabella was too young even to cohabit with her husband. She would remain in a ceremonial role for years, a perpetual reminder to both nations that their kings had promised not to kill each other, at least not yet. The wedding was staged with calculated magnificence. In Calais, under the wary eyes of both French and English nobility, the two courts mingled as though the Channel were nothing more than a broad moat in a shared garden. Richard presented himself as the perfect chivalric monarch, leaning on the symbolism of marrying youth and innocence as a way of cleansing the bloodstains from his crown. Isabella, for her part, stood small but composed, a princess already trained to perform the duties expected of her, bowing at the right moments, smiling at the crowd, and offering her hand to a man who could have been her father. The truce that followed was more symbolic than transformative. While the official hostilities between France and England paused, the war's machinery kept turning in the background. Skirmishes still flared on the fringes, allies still plotted, and mistrust ran like a cold current beneath every diplomatic exchange. In England, Richard's political position was precarious, and the peace with France was resented by many of his own subjects who preferred the honour of battle to the humility of negotiation. Isabella's life at the English court was both lavish and constrained. She had her own household, her own attendants, and the trappings of a queen, but she remained a child separated from her family, far from the familiar cadence of the French language spoken at home. Richard treated her with a careful, almost ceremonial respect, as though she were more artifact than wife. This was, in truth, the safest way to treat her, as a living treaty rather than a person to be loved or neglected. But treaties are fragile, and kings are mortal. In 1399, Richard was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. The change was sudden and violent, and it threw Isabella's life into uncertainty. The new king had no interest in honouring Richard's peace with France or in keeping his widow at the English court. She was just 13, and her position shifted overnight from queen consort to political bargaining chip once again. Henry IV tried to suggest that Isabella marry his son, the future Henry V, thereby turning her from Richard's widow into a link to the new dynasty. Isabella refused. It was one of the few moments in her young life where she exerted genuine agency. She would not marry the son of the man who had overthrown her husband, no matter how neatly it might have tied the Anglo-French knot. Her refusal was a quiet rebellion, but it resonated across the diplomatic tables of Europe. Eventually, negotiations for her return to France succeeded. In 1401, she left England with a retinue and her dignity intact, though the peace her marriage had symbolized was already crumbling. Back in France, she resumed life as a royal daughter, now more valuable than ever as a political asset. Within a few years, she was married again, this time to her cousin Charles, Duke of Orléans, a match entirely within the French sphere. Isabella's story could be read as a lesson in the futility of using marriage to end war. The truce her wedding to Richard II had created lasted just a few years, and the 100 Years' War would grind on for decades afterward, swallowing entire generations. She had been paraded as the personification of peace, but she was powerless to enforce it. Her life was the embodiment of a paradox. The idea that you can bind enemies together through marriage, when in reality you are only binding the people in the marriage. And yet, for a brief moment, she had been the axis around which two great powers rotated, however reluctantly. That kind of symbolism is not nothing. It can stall a war, delay a battle, or buy enough time for a king to prepare his next move. But it is never a guarantee of anything lasting. Isabella's brief tenure as Queen of England was less a bridge between nations than a pause in the firing of cannons. The futility of her union would echo in the next story, where another French princess would cross the same channel to marry the very man who had shattered her homeland's pride on the battlefield. Catherine of Valois' wedding to Henry V was not about truce, it was about conquest, dressed in bridal white. Catherine of Valois. Catherine was born in 1401 into a France that was unravelling at the seams, a realm gnawed from within by civil war and from without by the relentless pressure of England. Her father, Charles VI, known in polite chronicles as Charles the Mad, had long since drifted in and out of sanity, leaving the actual governance of France in the hands of whichever faction managed to keep the crown within reach at any given week. It was a court of whispers, shifting alliances, and swords hidden in smiles. Catherine's mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was shrewd, politically ruthless, and deeply unpopular, accused by chroniclers of every sin from treachery to extravagance. By the time Catherine was a young teenager, England's King Henry V had emerged as the most dangerous threat to France in a century. He was not content with the occasional raid or border skirmish. He wanted the French crown itself. His claim went back to the tangle of dynastic rights that had sparked the 100 Years' War, and his appetite for proving it was whetted by victory. In 1415, he won the Battle of Agincourt, an almost mythic English triumph where mud, longbows, and French overconfidence combined to turn a French noble army into so much armoured wreckage. After Agincourt, Henry tightened the noose. Campaigns through Normandy burned towns, seized fortresses, and shattered any pretense that France could mount an effective counter-offensive. Catherine, a royal daughter, became an increasingly valuable bargaining chip in a war that was starting to look unwinnable for her side. Her marriage was no longer just a matter of court intrigue. It became the keystone of a peace that would be written entirely on English terms. The Treaty of Troy in 1420 was nothing less than a surrender disguised as diplomacy. Henry V would marry Catherine of Valois, be recognized as heir to the French throne, and rule jointly with Charles VI until the older king's death. In exchange, Henry agreed not to press his advantage by outright deposing his father-in-law. For France, it was the best option in the sense that total destruction was worse. For Catherine, it meant marrying the conqueror of her homeland, the man whose banners had flown over the field where French knights lay broken and unhorsed. The wedding was staged in Troy, with all the glittering trappings the moment demanded. The chroniclers talk of gowns threaded with gold, a church heavy with incense, and the mingling of English and French nobles, awkward partners in a dance choreographed by necessity. Catherine was described as beautiful, serene, and dignified. None of the official accounts mention the grim absurdity of the situation. A young woman pledging her loyalty and body to the very man who had spent the last 5 years dismantling her country brick by brick. Henry V treated Catherine with courtesy, though never as an equal partner in rule. She was a trophy in one sense, but a valuable one. Her very presence beside him was meant to silence any lingering doubts about his legitimacy as future King of France. Their marriage was, by most accounts, not entirely cold. They travelled together, and she accompanied him to England, where she was received with the adulation accorded to a victorious king's bride. She bore him a son in 1421, another Henry, whose mere existence was intended to unite the crowns of England and France under one tiny head. But fate, as usual, refused to cooperate. In 1422, Henry V fell ill during a campaign and died suddenly at the age of 35. Within months, Charles VI of France also died, leaving the infant Henry VI as king of both realms. Catherine was now the queen mother of an empire in theory, and the widow of a conqueror in practice. Her position was prestigious but perilous. In England, the Regency government eyed her with suspicion. She was young, French, and, in their view, potentially dangerous if she were to remarry unwisely. Parliament passed laws restricting her ability to wed without the king's consent, ostensibly to protect the boy, king's interests, but really to keep her from producing rival claimants to the throne. These restrictions were humiliating for a Queen Dowager who had once been a central figure in the great treaty that reshaped two kingdoms. Catherine's later years are marked by the kind of quiet rebellion that slips into the margins of history books. Sometime in the mid-1422, she formed a relationship, possibly a secret marriage, with a Welsh courtier named Owen Tudor. The match was wildly inappropriate by the standards of the day, a royal widow and a man of comparatively minor birth. Yet it was through this unlikely union that the Tudor dynasty began. Their sons would rise to prominence, and one grandson, Henry VII, would seize the English crown, ending the Wars of the Roses and founding a new royal line. The irony is sharp enough to cut. Catherine of Valois, the French princess married to England's great conqueror, became the grandmother of a dynasty that would define England for a century. Her first marriage had been about political conquest, dressed as romance. Her second, if indeed it was a marriage at all, was about personal choice, scandal be damned. The marriage to Henry V, however, remained the emblem of her political role. the embodiment of a peace won through total capitulation. The Treaty of Troyes collapsed almost immediately after Henry's death. France rallied under Charles VII, aided by figures like Joan of Arc, and by mid-century the English dream of a dual crown was in ruins. Catherine's wedding had bought Henry a few years of legitimacy and breathing room for his armies, but it had not changed the deep hostility between the two nations. When she died in 1437, at just 35, Catherine left behind a complicated legacy. To the English, she was the queen who had given birth to their king and legitimized their claim to France. To the French, she was the princess who had been given away as part of the worst treaty in their history. To her descendants, she was the matriarch of a dynasty born from both conquest and defiance. It's a reminder that marrying your enemy rarely erases the enemy. Sometimes it just shifts the battlefield into the marriage chamber, the council room, and the nursery. The war that brought Henry and Catherine together outlived them both by decades. And in that way, her story bleeds directly into another Valois bride's a woman, whose wedding was not the end of a war, but an attempt to fuse two irreconcilable faiths into one fragile marriage bed. Margaret of Valois would find that religious wars are far less willing to be tamed by vows than even the longest dynastic feuds. Margaret of Valois, Queen Margot, to her admirers and detractors alike, was born in 1553 into a France that could not decide whether it was Catholic or Protestant, but seemed absolutely certain that it preferred killing people to resolving the question. She was the daughter of King Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother who could turn a dinner party into a diplomatic coup and a diplomatic coup into a bloodbath before dessert. Margaret grew up in the glittering but venomous courts of the Valois dynasty, a world where allegiances were as changeable as the embroidery on a doublet. She was known for her intelligence, her wit, and her beauty qualities that made her both admired and weaponized. Her mother, Catherine, recognized early that Margaret could be used as a bridge between France's two warring confessions, the Catholics, represented by her own family, and the Huguenots, France's militant Protestants led by the Bourbon family. The 1562nd were a parade of civil wars, assassinations, massacres, and betrayals so convoluted that chroniclers struggled to keep track of who had stabbed whom last. Amid this chaos, someone, probably Catherine herself, hit upon the idea of marrying Margaret to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant leader of royal blood. The theory was that this marriage would heal France's religious wounds. The reality was that it was like throwing a wedding banquet in a room full of gunpowder and handing everyone a lit candle. Margaret herself had little choice in the matter. She was a loyal Catholic, but she understood the political logic, if not the personal sense, of the match. Henry of Navarre was witty, charismatic, and clever qualities she could respect, but he was also a man who had spent his life fighting the very cause her family championed. Still, in August 1572, the two were wed in Paris in a ceremony that tried desperately to look like a national reconciliation. The wedding was an event of enormous political theatre. Huguenot nobles poured into Paris for the celebration, their swords sheathed for the occasion. The streets were draped with banners, the churches rang bells, and the royal family smiled as if all was forgiven. Margaret's gown glittered. Henry's demeanour was suitably princely. The marriage was conducted according to Catholic rites, with the Protestant groom standing outside the cathedral for the key portions he could not in conscience attend. It was a compromise, and like most compromises in France at the time, it was a bad omen. 5 days later, the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre began. Whether it was planned in advance or sparked by a failed assassination attempt on a Huguenot leader, the result was the same. Paris turned into a killing ground. Catholic mobs, with royal complicity, hunted down and slaughtered thousands of Protestants. The Seine ran red, the streets were littered with corpses. Margaret, still in the first week of her marriage, found herself sheltering terrified Huguenot courtiers in her rooms, smuggling some to safety, while others died within shouting distance. Henry of Navarre survived by agreeing to convert to Catholicism, at least publicly. He and Margaret remained in a tense marriage, bound more by politics than affection. He would later return to Protestantism, escape Paris, and resume his role as a rebel leader. Margaret's own loyalties became complicated. She maintained correspondence with Protestant leaders, sometimes aided her husband's political maneuvers, and at other times opposed him outright. Their marriage was a battlefield of its own. Both were unfaithful, both were politically ambitious, both were accustomed to intrigue. They spent long stretches apart, sometimes as prisoners, sometimes as exiles, sometimes as uneasy allies. Margaret was eventually caught up in her own scandals, accused of conspiring against her brothers, hoarding weapons in her apartments, and plotting rebellions. She spent years imprisoned in the castle of Eusen, which she transformed into a salon of culture and politics, proving that even in captivity she could be a force to reckon with. Henry, for his part, would eventually become King Henry IV of France, famously declaring, "Paris is worth a mass," as he converted again to Catholicism to secure the throne. By then, his marriage to Margaret was politically useless. It was annulled in 1599 after nearly 3 decades of a union that had failed at its stated purpose from the very beginning. Margaret, freed from the constraints of the marriage, returned to Paris and reinvented herself. She became a patron of the arts, a writer, and a figure of cultural influence. Her memoirs, one of the earliest by a French queen, are sharp, candid, and occasionally scathing, especially about the hypocrisies of court life. She did not shy away from discussing the absurdity of her wedding as a peace treaty and the carnage that followed almost instantly. Looking back, her marriage to Henry of Navarre is one of history's more bitter ironies. Intended as a bridge between two faiths, it instead became a prelude to one of the most infamous massacres in European history. The idea that marriage could heal such a deep ideological rift was either breathtakingly naive or deeply cynical, perhaps both. Margaret played her role with as much dignity and survival instinct as she could muster, but she must have known early on that the union was a performance for the benefit of a fractured kingdom, not a genuine joining of hearts or causes. And yet, even in failure, the marriage had lasting consequences. It bound the Catholic Valois and Protestant Bourbon bloodlines in a way that no war could undo, paving the way for Henry's eventual succession. It gave France its first Bourbon monarch, setting the stage for a new chapter in its history, one still haunted by the religious strife the marriage had been meant to end. Margaret's life, full of reversals and reinventions, shows how a queen could survive the collapse of her political purpose. She outlived the marriage, the massacres, and the dynasty that had shaped her fate. She died in 1615, an elder stateswoman of scandal and survival, having outlasted most of the men who once tried to use her as a peace treaty in a dress. Her story bleeds naturally into another queen who married not just to unite warring families, but to try briefly, desperately to cool a war between nations that had been gnawing at each other for centuries. Margaret Tudor would carry her English rose north to marry the thistle of Scotland, hoping that peace might follow her bridal procession across the border. Margaret Tudor. Margaret Tudor was born in 1489 into a house that had only just stitched itself together after decades of civil war. She was the daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the human peace treaty, who had united the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York after the Wars of the Roses. From birth, Margaret embodied the message her parents wanted the world to believe, that marriage could mend nations. It's likely she heard that refrain her entire childhood, repeated at court, embroidered into the cushions, whispered behind fans. And like most children raised on political platitudes, she eventually learned the sharp edge of their irony. In the early 1502, England's relationship with Scotland was defined by suspicion and periodic bloodletting. The borderlands were a perpetual bruise, raided by both sides, and treaties were as brittle as winter branches. The idea of marrying Margaret to James IV of Scotland was sold as a masterstroke. The union of an English princess and a Scottish king could knit the two kingdoms into a lasting peace. The phrase "the union of the thistle and the rose" was passed around like a prophecy. It sounded poetic enough to almost disguise its absurdity. Margaret was 14 when the arrangements became official. In 1503, she set out from London on a long, ceremonial journey north, a kind of slow-moving propaganda parade. Towns along the route staged pageants in her honour, blending English pride with carefully scripted goodwill toward the Scots. She crossed the border at Berwick upon Tweed, greeted by Scottish nobility in full regalia, the air thick with the scent of horses, peat smoke, and guarded optimism. James IV was a striking figure, charismatic, intelligent, and known for both his chivalry and his political cunning. He was also in his late 20s, a full 14 years older than his bride. This was no scandal by the standards of the age, but it underscored the fact that Margaret's marriage was less a romance than a transaction between kingdoms. The wedding at Holyrood Abbey was conducted with great pomp, rich tapestries, choirs, and the mingling of two courts that had spent centuries trying to outfight each other. For a brief while, the arrangement seemed to work. James treated Margaret with courtesy and, unusually for the time, allowed her a degree of influence in court life. She adapted to the rhythms of Edinburgh, learned to navigate the Scottish nobility's rivalries, and bore James several children, though only one Prince James survived into adulthood. She played the role of peacemaker, writing to her father and brother, the future Henry VIII, to smooth over disputes that inevitably flared between England and Scotland. But marriage, even royal marriage, could not rewrite geopolitics. The peace her wedding had promised began to fray almost as soon as it was signed. England and Scotland found themselves pulled into the wider web of European politics, especially when Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509. The new English king was far less patient with Scottish independence, and his aggressive policies toward France put Scotland, France's traditional ally, in an impossible position. By 1513, James IV was at war with England, fulfilling Scotland's obligations under the Auld Alliance with France. That September, James marched his army south and met the English at the Battle of Flodden. The result was catastrophic. The Scottish army was annihilated, and James himself was killed, the last reigning monarch in Britain to die in battle. Margaret, at just 23, was suddenly a widow and the mother of a toddler king. The peace she had been married to create was gone, replaced by a political crisis that threatened to tear Scotland apart. As Queen Dowager, Margaret was named regent for her son, James V, but her position was precarious. She was English by birth, ruling in a country still smarting from defeat at English hands. Scottish nobles distrusted her loyalties, suspecting she might favour her brother's interests over those of her son's realm. Margaret's own decisions added to the instability. In 1514, barely a year into her regency, she remarried, choosing Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus, a powerful nobleman from a faction unpopular with much of the court. This union alienated many of her supporters and gave her enemies the excuse they needed to strip her of the regency. She fled to England for a time, leaving her young son behind, an exile from the kingdom she had once been sent to bind together. Her life became a cycle of returns and exiles, reconciliations and betrayals. She fought fiercely for influence over her son, sometimes aligning with pro-English factions, sometimes against them, depending on what would best secure her position. Her marriage to Angus soured into open hostility, and she eventually sought an annulment echoing her brother Henry VIII's later marital manoeuvres, though without the same world-shaking consequences. By the 1522nd, Margaret had weathered enough political storms to know that peace between England and Scotland was not going to be delivered by a single royal wedding. She continued to manoeuvre in the shifting alliances of Scottish politics, occasionally serving as a go-between for her brother and her son's government. Yet the dream of uniting the two crowns remained just that, a dream deferred again, and then eventually realized not by diplomacy, but by inheritance. That inheritance came long after Margaret's death in 1541. Her great-grandson, James VI of Scotland, would inherit the English throne in 1603 after the death of Elizabeth I, uniting the crowns in his own person. It was a dynastic outcome that could be traced directly back to Margaret's marriage to James IV. The thistle and the rose had indeed been joined, but not in her lifetime, and not in the way her wedding day had promised. Margaret's story reads like an unvarnished case study in the limits of matrimonial diplomacy. Her marriage began with poetic imagery and public optimism, only to dissolve into the same old patterns of war, suspicion, and political opportunism. She survived it all by adapting, shifting loyalties when necessary, and asserting her authority where she could. And in that sense, she sets the stage for another royal bride who was dispatched northward for similar reasons. Centuries earlier, a girl sent from England to Scotland not to merge crowns, but to seal a fragile peace after decades of bloody conflict. Joan of the Tower would grow up as a queen consort in enemy territory, learning just how thin the ice of peace could be when it was built on forced vows. Joan of the Tower. Joan of the Tower came into the world in 1321 as the daughter of one of England's most infamous royal pairings, King Edward II and Isabella of France. Her father's reign was a storm of military humiliation, baronial rebellions, and personal scandals. Her mother, nicknamed the She-Wolf of France by later chroniclers, would eventually orchestrate his deposition. Joan was born into a palace that was really a fortress of whispered conspiracies, and she was given her unusual moniker because she first saw daylight in the Tower of London, a place that, in her lifetime, was as much a royal residence as it was a prison. The name stuck, and it would come to feel like a strange prophecy. Joan's childhood was shaped by the bitter and costly war between England and Scotland. The First War of Scottish Independence had been raging since before she was born, sparked by England's attempts to impose overlordship and Scotland's stubborn refusal to bow. The conflict had already produced legendary figures William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, and had bled both kingdoms of men and money. By the time Joan was old enough to be paraded before foreign ambassadors, Scotland was still holding its own under Robert the Bruce's leadership. But everyone knew that a lasting peace would require something more than another temporary truce. That something more turned out to be Joan herself. In 1328, when she was just 7 years old, her marriage was negotiated as part of the Treaty of Northampton. It was an extraordinary agreement for the time. England formally recognised Scotland's independence, and in return, Robert the Bruce's young son and heir, David, would marry Joan. The union was intended as a permanent knot tying the two realms together, with the idea that any future wars would be unthinkable if the royal families were one family. It was the medieval equivalent of a handshake and wedding robes. Joan's journey north was ceremonial, but the subtext was inescapable. She was being sent to live among people her country had tried and failed to conquer for decades. For England, she was a symbol of diplomacy and goodwill. For Scotland, she was a living hostage for peace. At Berwick-upon-Tweed, she met her 9-year-old groom, David II. Their wedding was a spectacle, banners snapping in the wind, clergy intoning blessings, nobles on both sides putting on their best performances of reconciliation. But beyond the feast tables, there was an unease neither bride nor groom could name. They were too young to understand the full weight of what their vows represented. Life for Joan in Scotland was not a fairy tale transplant. She entered a court that was still raw from decades of conflict. Robert the Bruce died the following year, leaving David to inherit a crown at just 5 years old, with Scotland in the hands of regents. As Queen Consort in name, Joan had no political power, but her presence was supposed to be a daily reminder of the treaty that had brought her north. Unfortunately, treaties have a way of aging badly. The Peace of Northampton began to unravel almost immediately. In 1332, Edward Balliol, the son of a former Scottish king and a puppet of disaffected Scottish nobles, backed by England, invaded and briefly seized the throne. David and Joan were driven into exile in France, finding refuge at the court of Philip VI. The irony was thick. The English princess and her Scottish husband, both children, now dependent on the hospitality of the French king, while their kingdom's armies clashed yet again. They spent nearly 7 years in France, growing from children into adolescents far from the lands they were meant to unite. Joan, by now a teenager, adapted to the rhythms of the French court, a place of polished manners, subtle intrigues, and layers of etiquette. She and David grew up together, but not necessarily together in the sense of shared intimacy. Their marriage, like many royal pairings, was built on political scaffolding, not personal compatibility. In 1341, the couple returned to Scotland, where David resumed his reign in earnest. For a brief moment, stability seemed possible. But England, now ruled by Joan's older brother Edward III, was in no mood to let old grudges rest. The Second War of Scottish Independence ignited, fueled by Edward's determination to install Balliol once again and to assert English dominance over the north. Joan's position was uniquely strained. She was the sister of the enemy king, the wife of the embattled Scottish king, and a queen whose loyalties were questioned in every direction. In 1346, David led a disastrous invasion of England in support of France, Scotland's ally in the broader conflict of the 100 Years' War. At the Battle of Neville's Cross, the Scottish army was routed, and David was captured. He would spend the next 11 years as a prisoner in England, leaving Joan in an impossible position. She returned to England as part of negotiations for his ransom, spending much of her time apart from her husband. The distance was both physical and emotional. The marriage had never been warm, and the long separation only deepened the rift. By the time David was released in 1357, their relationship was irretrievably strained. They had no children, and David's rumoured infidelities were an open secret. Joan remained in England after his return to Scotland, choosing the familiarity of her brother's court over the chilly welcome she might have received in Edinburgh. She died in 1362 at the age of 41, a queen consort in title but a political exile in practice. Her life is a quiet but telling example of the limits of matrimonial diplomacy. The Treaty of Northampton was hailed as a perpetual peace between England and Scotland, yet within 4 years of her wedding, the two kingdoms were back at war. Joan's marriage to David II did not create a lasting union of hearts or crowns. Instead, it became another entry in the long ledger of failed attempts to tame centuries of hostility through arranged unions. And yet, her story flows almost seamlessly into another tale of an English princess sent north not in the 14th century, but a generation earlier. Margaret of England, born in 1240, would marry Alexander III of Scotland in yet another grand attempt to end the cycles of Anglo-Scottish conflict, proving that history has a taste for repetition when it comes to marrying daughters to enemies. Margaret of England, 1240-1275. Margaret of England was born into an uneasy peace that could dissolve at the first insult, raid, or unlucky inheritance. She was the daughter of King Henry III of England and Eleanor of Provence, arriving in 1240 as part of a generation of royal children, destined to be used like gilded chess pieces in the endless game between England and Scotland. By the time she could walk, her name was already being spoken in negotiations. Marriages between the two crowns had been tried before. Sometimes they bought a decade of quiet, sometimes less than a year, but both realms kept returning to the same well. Perhaps they believed that blood ties could do what treaties could not, or perhaps they simply ran out of ideas that didn't involve burning each other's castles. The relationship between England and Scotland in Margaret's childhood was one of guarded hostility. England's Plantagenet kings viewed themselves as the senior partner, and Scotland's monarchs then under the Canmore dynasty pushed back with varying degrees of defiance. Borders were contested, allegiances with France and Norway complicated matters, and the families ruling each kingdom viewed one another through a lens of suspicion sharpened by generations of skirmishes. A royal marriage offered, at least on parchment, the illusion of turning enemies into in-laws. Margaret's intended was Alexander III of Scotland, a boy not much older than she was. Their betrothal was finalized when she was still a child, the deal sealed with the usual flurry of parchment, seals, and solemn oaths about perpetual peace. Both courts congratulated themselves on their cleverness, ignoring the fact that perpetual peace had already been promised and broken more times than anyone cared to count. In December 1251, Margaret made the journey north for the wedding. She was 11 years old, travelling with a retinue that projected both the wealth of the English crown and the subtle reminder that she was too valuable to be harmed. At York Minster, the marriage took place under the eyes of both kingdoms' leading nobles. The bride and groom were children, reciting vows they had been told to memorize. Their marriage, a stage set for the adults in the room. The English chroniclers waxed lyrical about her beauty and grace. The Scottish ones were careful to praise her lineage while asserting Alexander's equal standing. After the ceremonies, the couple went to Edinburgh, where Margaret began her life as Queen Consort of Scotland. Her role, at least in theory, was to embody the new bond between the two realms. In practice, she entered a court where the politics were intricate and often hostile to English influence. The Scottish nobility was fiercely protective of its independence, and Margaret, English-born, English-educated, was viewed with both curiosity and caution. The marriage, being between two adolescents, did not immediately produce children. This was unsurprising, but in medieval politics, the absence of heirs was a gap that could be filled by rumour and manipulation. Regents and advisors hovered over the young couple, each faction angling for influence. Margaret, still in her teens, learned the art of navigating conversations that said one thing and meant another. By the late 1252, the marriage began to take on a more conventional shape as the pair grew older. In 1261, Margaret gave birth to their first child, a daughter also named Margaret. Over the following years, she bore more children, including Alexander, Prince of Scotland. These births solidified her place in the Canmore dynasty and gave the Anglo-Scottish peace a stronger veneer. After all, the future of both realms was now bound up in these young royals who carried the blood of two kingdoms. But peace remained fragile. The 1262 saw tensions flare as Henry III's rule in England came under strain from the baronial revolt led by Simon de Montfort. Margaret, though far from the heart of the conflict, could not escape its ripples. The Scottish court watched England's instability with interest, some seeing opportunity, others fearing that turmoil across the border could spill north. In these years, Margaret's English heritage was a double-edged sword, useful when smoothing relations with her father, suspect when England's troubles made Scottish independence seem more vulnerable. Margaret's personal relationship with Alexander III appears to have been one of mutual respect, if not the romantic ideal sung by courtly poets. Alexander was an able king, focused on consolidating Scotland's authority over the Western Isles and Orkney, and on maintaining Scotland's relative stability amid England's unrest. Margaret, for her part, fulfilled her duties as queen consort, diligently patronising religious houses, participating in ceremonial functions, and raising their children with the expectation that they would someday be linchpins of European diplomacy. Her position, however, was always political first, personal second. She was a human reminder to the Scottish court of the treaty that had brought her north, and to the English court of the investment made in her marriage. It was an arrangement that could feel like a velvet cage, comfortable enough, but still confining. In 1275, Margaret died suddenly at the age of 35, her life bookended by political necessity. Her death was mourned in both England and Scotland, but it also reopened questions about the stability of the Anglo-Scottish peace. Without her, the bond between the two crowns rested solely on her children, and in medieval politics, children were only as valuable as the alliances they could make and the heirs they could produce. Margaret's marriage to Alexander III did not end the centuries-old tension between England and Scotland, but it did help to preserve a generation of relative stability. Her children's marriages would extend the Anglo-Scottish network of alliances into Norway and beyond, and her lineage would later play a crucial role in the contested successions that plunged Scotland into the wars of independence again at the turn of the 14th century. If there is a lesson in her story, it is that royal marriages could slow the drums of war, but rarely silence them. Margaret's life shows the paradox at the heart of such unions. She was sent to embody peace, but her very presence at court was a constant reminder of the enemy's proximity. And so, as one English-born queen in Scotland passed from the scene, another would step forward in a later century to take up the same impossible role. Mary Tudor, sister to Henry VIII, would be dispatched not to Edinburgh but across the Channel, marrying France's aging monarch in yet another carefully calculated move to turn bitter rivalry into a smiling portrait of unity. Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. Mary Tudor was born in 1496 into the golden dawn of the Tudor dynasty, new, untested, and eager to prove that it could do more than just survive a battlefield. She was the youngest daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, which made her both politically valuable and, in the eyes of her family, an asset to be deployed with precision. Her childhood was steeped in the lessons her parents had learned the hard way. Peace is cheaper than war, but it is rarely free. Every treaty has its price, and sometimes that price is your own blood on a foreign throne. From the moment she could walk across a great hall without tripping over her skirts, Mary was considered a bargaining chip in England's foreign policy. The Tudors had enemies and rivals in every direction, but none loomed larger than France. Centuries of war had left deep scars, yet also a strange familiarity. England and France knew each other like two old rivals who could finish each other's sentences, mostly because those sentences usually began with insults. By the early 1500s, though, both nations saw a temporary advantage in détente. Henry VIII, newly crowned in 1509 and burning with the desire to strut across the European stage, understood that a royal marriage could buy him breathing room. The chosen match was between Mary and Louis XII of France. On paper, it was a masterstroke. England's young, beautiful princess marrying France's aging, battle-worn king, sealing a peace that would stabilize the Channel and allow both crowns to focus on their continental ambitions. In reality, it was a collision of youth and age, desire and duty, hope and inevitability. Mary was just 18 when the match was confirmed. Louis was 52, twice widowed and in failing health. Mary did not want the marriage. She had, in fact, fallen in love with Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, her brother's closest friend, and a man whose charm was matched only by his recklessness. She begged Henry to let her marry for love, but the king was unmoved until she struck a bargain. She would agree to marry Louis if Henry promised she could choose her second husband herself, should she ever be widowed. It was a dangerous concession for a king to make, and Mary must have known that his word might prove slippery when politics intervened. In October 1514, Mary crossed the Channel to Calais, accompanied by a retinue of English courtiers and a wardrobe designed to stun the French court into admiration. The wedding took place in Abbeville, a spectacle of silk, jewels, and ceremonial grandeur. Chroniclers wrote of Mary's beauty in almost excessive terms, as if her youth and radiance could somehow compensate for the age and infirmity of her new husband. Louis XII, for his part, seemed determined to make the most of his young bride, though the strain may have hastened his end. Within 3 months of the wedding, he was dead, leaving Mary, at 19, the Dowager Queen of France. The official line was that illness had claimed him, but the speed of his decline and the wink-wink comments of some contemporaries suggest that the sudden exertion of marriage to a spirited teenager might have been unwise. Now Mary was in a precarious position. French politics were a treacherous field, and the new king, Francis I, was a man of considerable ambition and appetite. As a young, wealthy widow, Mary was a tempting prize for any number of European princes. She also knew that her brother Henry might already be thinking of how to use her again in his diplomatic games. If she wanted to seize her promised freedom, she would have to act quickly. She did. In a move that scandalized both the English and French courts, Mary secretly married Charles Brandon in early 1515, without Henry's permission. The marriage took place in France, with the tacit complicity of Francis I, who may have enjoyed the chaos it caused for his English counterpart. When news reached London, Henry was furious, partly because Brandon had acted without royal consent, and partly because Mary's value as a bargaining chip had just plummeted. The scandal might have ended in ruin for both Mary and Brandon, but here Mary showed the same political instincts she had inherited from her formidable mother. She appealed directly to her brother, framing the marriage as a fulfillment of the promise he had made her before she sailed to France. She played the penitent sister, while also reminding Henry that public sympathy would side with the romantic narrative, a young widow who married for love rather than politics. It worked. Henry relented, imposing only a hefty fine on the couple, which they paid off in installments over several years. Back in England, Mary settled into a quieter life at court, though her marriage to Brandon was not without drama. They had 4 children, and Mary remained a figure of beauty and grace in the Tudor court, but she never again played a central role in international diplomacy. Her brief tenure as Queen of France was remembered as a footnote in a much larger geopolitical dance, a marriage that symbolized peace for a season but was never meant to last. Yet the consequences rippled outward. Mary's marriage to Louis XII did achieve its immediate goal. It bought England and France a fragile peace in 1514, giving Henry VIII time to pursue his campaigns elsewhere. It also set the stage for the tangled family connections that would later complicate the Tudor succession. Through her daughter Frances, Mary was the grandmother of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, whose own reign would be another brief, ill-fated chapter in England's royal history. Mary's story is a study in the collision between personal desire and political necessity. She went to France as the smiling embodiment of a treaty, knowing full well that her role was temporary. She endured the match with an older, ailing king, calculated her escape route, and managed to outmaneuver the machinery of state to secure the husband she actually wanted. Few princesses of her era could claim such a victory, even if it came at the cost of royal disapproval and a reduced political role. But the union she had been sent to forge, the symbolic clasp of hands between England and France, was as short-lived as her first marriage. Peace, once again, proved to be a rented garment rather than a permanent robe. And that same pattern would appear in the life of another royal woman centuries earlier, whose marriage turned on an even sharper irony. Emma of Normandy would wed not just an enemy king, but the man who had conquered her first husband's realm. Emma of Normandy. Emma of Normandy entered the world around the year 985, born into a ducal family that ruled the rugged coastline between the mouth of the Seine and the English Channel. Normandy was a place forged by contradictions. The descendants of Viking raiders who had settled and intermarried with the local Frankish population, a court that spoke French but still admired the Old Norse sagas, and a ruling house that balanced on the knife edge between French and English politics. Emma's upbringing prepared her for the delicate art of survival. In such a place, she learned languages, courtly manners, the game of alliances. But no amount of education could fully prepare her for the peculiar twist of fate that would define her life, being married, in turn, to a king of England, and then to the foreign conqueror who overthrew him. Her first marriage was to Ethelred II of England, known unflatteringly to history as the Unready, from the Old English unrad, meaning poorly advised, rather than unprepared. Ethelred's reign was already under siege, literally, when the match was made. Viking raids on England had intensified in the 982nd and 992nd, culminating in full-scale invasions. Marrying Emma, the sister of Richard II, Duke of Normandy, was meant to secure an ally across the Channel who could help counter the Danish threat. The union was political first, personal second, and as with so many royal matches, affection was optional. Emma arrived in England in 1002, a young bride in a foreign court, where her role was to produce heirs and embody the alliance between her homeland and her husband's kingdom. Almost immediately, she became entangled in one of the darker episodes of Ethelred's rule, the Street Bryce's Day Massacre, in which Danish settlers in England were slaughtered on the king's orders. The massacre, intended as a show of strength, had the opposite effect. It provoked the wrath of King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark, escalating the conflict. Emma's position as queen must have been precarious. She was meant to symbolize stability, yet she stood at the center of a kingdom sliding toward chaos. Over the next decade, England's fortunes declined. Danish forces landed and pillaged with impunity. Ethelred's inability or unwillingness to mount an effective defense eroded his authority. In 1013, Svein Forkbeard invaded outright, and Ethelred fled to Normandy with Emma and their children. For a time, they lived in exile at her brother's court, the English crown seemingly lost. Svein died suddenly in 1014, giving Ethelred a chance to return, but the restoration was short-lived. His health was failing, and the Danish threat remained. When Ethelred died in 1016, his son Edmund Ironside fought valiantly to hold the throne against Svein's son, Knut. But Edmund's death that same year left Knut as the undisputed ruler of England. This was the moment when Emma's life took its most unexpected turn. Instead of being sent back to Normandy or retiring into obscurity as the widow of a defeated king, she married Knut, the man who had conquered her late husband's realm. Why? The simplest answer is politics. By marrying Emma, Knut cemented his legitimacy in the eyes of the English nobility, especially in the south of the kingdom, where her children by Ethelred were recognized. For Emma, the marriage was a calculated gamble. It allowed her to remain queen, protect her children's interests, and wield influence in a new regime rather than being sidelined. It also meant that she had to navigate the dangerous optics of going from the wife of England's king to the wife of his conqueror without appearing disloyal to either side. Knut, to his credit, treated Emma as a partner of sorts. She appeared with him in official charters and on coins, a sign of her elevated status. They had children together, including a son, Harthacnut, who would one day become king. Emma managed to balance the competing claims of her sons from her 2 marriages, though not without tension. The court was a nest of rivalries, with factions backing either Harthacnut or Emma's older son, Edward, later Edward the Confessor. Her influence during Cnut's reign was significant. She acted as a political bridge between the Anglo-Danish elite and the older Anglo-Saxon nobility, using her connections in Normandy and her position as queen to smooth over disputes. She also cultivated a reputation for piety and patronage, endowing churches and religious houses, which not only secured her soul in the eyes of the church, but also shored up her political capital. When Cnut died in 1035, Emma faced another round of instability. The English throne was contested between her sons and Cnut's other children by different mothers. Emma initially supported Harthacnut's claim, but with him occupied in Denmark, she threw her weight behind Harald Harefoot, Cnut's illegitimate son, as a temporary measure. This pragmatic choice backfired. Harold consolidated power and eventually drove Emma into exile. She returned in triumph in 1040 when Harthacnut finally came to England, restoring her position as Queen Mother. But the wheel turned again after Harthacnut's death in 1042, when her son Edward the Confessor ascended the throne. Edward harboured old resentments, perhaps from the years Emma had spent prioritising Harthacnut's claim over his. In 1043, he dramatically seized her lands and treasures, accusing her of conspiring with enemies. Though later reconciled, Emma never regained her former influence. Emma died in 1052, having been queen consort to 2 very different kings, one deposed, one victorious mother to kings from both marriages, and a political survivor in an age when royal widows were often discarded. Her life was a testament to the adaptability required of queens in a world where allegiances could shift overnight. She had been the bride sent to strengthen England against its enemies, then the widow who married the enemy himself, and finally the matriarch whose children would shape the realm for decades. Her story also underlines a grim truth about these political marriages. They were never about personal loyalty, only the shifting sands of power. Emma's unions with Ethelred and Cnut both served immediate political purposes, but neither could halt the cycles of war and betrayal that defined the age. And in that sense, her life serves as a prelude to another woman's tale, one in which the battlefield was not between England and Denmark, but between Gaelic Ireland and the Norse world. Gormlaith Ingen Merchada's marriage to the High King of Ireland would be as steeped in political danger as Emma's, but with an edge of personal vendetta sharp enough to draw blood. Gormlaith Ingen Merchada. Gormlaith Ingen Merchada was born in the mid-10th century into the tangled web of Irish and Norse politics, a world where alliances were written in marriage contracts and erased in battle. She was the daughter of Murchad mac Finn, King of Leinster, a province that in those days was less a united territory and more a patchwork of fiercely independent clans. Her lineage placed her in the upper tier of Gaelic nobility, but her destiny was not to remain neatly within one sphere. She was bound for marriages that would cross cultural, religious, and political lines, sometimes uniting rivals, sometimes stirring the pot until it boiled over. Leinster, in Gormlaith's youth, was a battlefield in miniature, constantly negotiating its place between the rising power of the High Kingship at Tara and the Norse Gaelic kingdoms that dotted Ireland's coasts. The Norse had been in Ireland for nearly 2 centuries by then, first as raiders, later as settlers in cities like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. By Gormlaith's lifetime, the Norse presence was woven into the political fabric, but the relationship between Gaels and Norse remained one of wary coexistence, punctuated by bouts of open war. Gormlaith's first marriage was to Amlaib Quaran, Olaf Sigtryggsson. the Norse Gaelic king of Dublin and York. This was no romantic union, it was a calculated alliance between her Leinsterkin and the Norse merchants and warriors who controlled Dublin's lucrative trade routes. As Queen of Dublin, Gormlaith occupied a position that demanded she navigate two very different cultural worlds, the Gaelic traditions of her birth and the Norse customs of her husband's court. The match strengthened Leinster's position and gave the Dublin Norse an important foothold in Irish politics, but like most alliances of convenience, it was vulnerable to shifting loyalties. The marriage to Amlieb eventually collapsed, whether through divorce, permissible under Gaelic law, or political estrangement. But Gormlaith was not a woman to retire quietly after her first match. She returned to Leinster and re-entered the political marriage market, this time aiming much higher. Her second husband was Mael Sicnail Mac Domnail, the High King of Ireland. By marrying him, Gormlaith inserted herself into the very centre of Irish power. This union, however, was also short-lived. Mael Sicnail's rule faced constant challenges, and his alliance with Leinster was as much a liability as an asset. When the political winds shifted, the marriage dissolved. In a time and place where divorce was a tool of kingship as much as of personal choice, Gormlaith's status as a twice-divorced queen did not diminish her desirability as a political partner, it only proved her adaptability. Her third and most famous marriage was to Brian Boru, the ambitious king of Munster who would go on to become High King of Ireland. Brian was a man in the process of reshaping Irish politics, consolidating power in a way that threatened both Leinster and the Norse enclaves. Marrying Gormlaith was a way to neutralise her family's opposition, or so he might have hoped. She was, after all, the sister of Mael Morda Mac, Murchada, King of Leinster, and thus a direct link to one of Brian's most persistent rivals. It was here that the marriage became a political chess match inside the walls of the royal household. Gormlaith's loyalties were complex. Her natal family in Leinster resented Brian's dominance, and her earlier ties to the Norse world meant she had sympathies beyond the Gaelic nobility. Chroniclers paint her as a schemer, encouraging her brother to rebel against Brian and drawing the Norse of Dublin into the conflict. Whether this was genuine manipulation or later propaganda is impossible to know, but it is certain that tensions between Brian and Leinster boiled over during her tenure as queen. The culmination came in 1014 at the Battle of Clontarf, one of the most famous clashes in Irish history. Brian's forces, supported by some Norse allies, faced a coalition of Leinster warriors and Dublin Norse under the leadership of her brother Mael Morda and her son Sitric Silkbeard from her first marriage to Amlieb. The fact that her husband, her brother, and her son were on opposing sides in the same battle gives you an idea of how tangled her life's alliances had become. Clontarf ended in a bloody victory for Brian's side, though Brian himself was killed in the aftermath, reportedly while praying in his tent. Mael Morda was slain, and Dublin's Norse power was weakened, though not extinguished. For Gormlaith, the battle's outcome was both a personal and political upheaval. She had lost a husband, a brother, and a great deal of influence in a single day. Yet she survived, as she always had, adapting to the new order. Later sources, particularly the saga literature, cast Gormlaith as a kind of femme fatale, a political firebrand whose beauty and ambition could topple kings. These portrayals are coloured by the biases of the time. Male chroniclers often found it convenient to blame women for wars sparked by deeper political tensions. Still, the consistency with which she appears in accounts of the era suggests she was indeed a figure of consequence, one who understood the leverage that came from being at the intersection of Gaelic and Norse power. Her life's arc is a reminder that in medieval Ireland, marriage was a diplomatic weapon as potent as any sword. She began as the link between Leinster and Dublin's Norse, became the consort of two high kings, and ended as a figure blamed perhaps unfairly for one of the most consequential battles in the island's history. Gormlaith's marriages never erased enmities, they merely reframed them, shifting the battlefield from open raids to dinner tables and council chambers. And in this way, her story echoes forward to another queen who married across a deep divide not between Gael and Norse, but between a Christian kingdom and a pagan power to the northeast. Jadwiga of Poland would face her own moment of dangerous diplomacy when she was wed to Jogaila of Lithuania, a man who had only recently been raiding her realm and who now stood at the altar as both enemy and salvation. Jadwiga of Poland. Jadwiga of Poland's story begins with a coronation her own in 1384, when she was just 10 years old. She was not crowned queen, but king of Poland, a deliberate choice by the Polish nobility to assert that her authority was sovereign, not merely the product of a future husband's power. The crown itself was heavy, literally and figuratively. Poland in the late 14th century was a kingdom at a crossroads. Wealthy, strategically placed, but hemmed in by rivals and threatened by the pagan Grand Duchy of Lithuania to the northeast, a power that had made a profession of raiding Polish lands. Jadwiga was the youngest daughter of King Louis I of Hungary and Poland and his wife, Elizabeth of Bosnia. When Louis died without a male heir, the Polish throne passed to Jadwiga, though she was raised in Hungary and initially betrothed to William of Habsburg, a boy she had known since childhood. That match made perfect dynastic sense for her mother, but the Polish nobility had other ideas. They saw a union with Austria as strategically risky. Austria was tied into the messy politics of the Holy Roman Empire and offered little protection against the pressing threat from Lithuania and the Teutonic Order. The alternative they favoured was bold, even improbable: marry Jadwiga to Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. On paper, this was absurd. Jogaila was a seasoned warlord in his 30s, Jadwiga a girl of 12. He was a pagan ruler whose armies had burned Polish towns. She was a Christian monarch crowned with the approval of the Pope. Yet, from the perspective of Polish statecraft, the match had a certain ruthless logic. If Jogaila married Jadwiga, he would have to convert to Christianity, bringing Lithuania, the largest remaining pagan state in Europe, into the Latin Christian fold. More importantly, it would end decades of cross-border raids and unite the two realms into a formidable bloc capable of standing against both the Teutonic Knights and the expansionist powers to the west and south. For Jadwiga, the proposal was both a political necessity and a personal betrayal. She had been fond of William of Habsburg. Chroniclers tell of a dramatic scene in which he arrived in Krakow to claim her hand, only to be barred by Polish nobles who insisted she marry Jogaila instead. One version of the story has her running to the castle gate, attempting to break through with an axe, only to be stopped by her attendants, a scene that, if true, suggests she understood the stakes and resented the loss of personal choice even at her young age. Yet the crown weighed heavier than her heart. In 1386, Jadwiga consented to the marriage. Jogaila was baptized as Władysław, taking the Christian name in honor of her ancestors, and their wedding was followed immediately by his coronation as King of Poland. Overnight, Jadwiga's former enemy had become her co-ruler. This was no quiet domestic arrangement. The marriage was a working partnership in which Jadwiga retained significant political authority. She was deeply involved in governance, hearing petitions, issuing decrees, and negotiating with foreign envoys. The union with Lithuania was not universally welcomed. Many Lithuanians resisted Christianization, and some Polish nobles questioned Jogaila's legitimacy, but Jadwiga's own stature as an anointed monarch helped smooth the political turbulence. The Queen King also took a personal interest in religious and cultural affairs. She used her position to promote education, most famously funding the restoration and expansion of the University of Krakow, later named the Jagiellonian University. Her piety was legendary, but it was not the ornamental variety favoured by court chroniclers. It had a practical edge. She saw the Christianization of Lithuania not as a symbolic victory, but as a way to knit the two peoples together under a shared religious framework, reducing the temptation for Jogaila's old allies to resume their raiding habits. Still, the marriage was born from an enemy pact, and that reality never entirely disappeared. Jogaila's early years as king were marked by a careful balancing act, honouring his Lithuanian roots while adapting to the expectations of the Polish crown. For Jadwiga, this meant living alongside a man who had once been the architect of raids on her realm, a man whose conversion was strategic as much as spiritual. The chroniclers, writing through the haze of later sainthood, tend to paint their relationship as harmonious. But the politics between them must have been complex, even tense. One of the defining episodes of Jadwiga's reign came in 1398, when her diplomatic skills were tested in negotiations over Samogitia, a contested region between Lithuania and the Teutonic Order. Her ability to mediate between her husband's Lithuanian allies and the Polish nobility showed the very reason her marriage had been arranged in the first place. She was the human bridge across a cultural and political chasm. Without her, the union might have collapsed under its own contradictions. Tragically, Jadwiga's life was short. In 1399, she gave birth to a daughter, also named Elizabeth, who died within weeks. Jadwiga herself fell gravely ill, likely from complications of childbirth, and died shortly afterward at the age of 25. Her death was a national calamity. She had been the living embodiment of the Polish-Lithuanian Union, and her absence left Jogaila to navigate its preservation without her. In the centuries that followed, Jadwiga was remembered less for the political cunning that had defined her reign, and more for her saintly piety. She was canonized in 1997, her image polished into that of a holy queen whose self-sacrifice brought peace to her people. But beneath the hagiography lies the harder truth. She was a ruler who agreed to marry an enemy, not out of docility, but because she understood the brutal arithmetic of medieval geopolitics. The cost of refusing would have been war. The cost of accepting was a lifetime bound to the man who had once ordered raids into her kingdom. Her legacy was not just the Christianization of Lithuania or the expansion of Poland's influence, but the enduring political entity that her marriage helped to create. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would eventually become one of the largest and most diverse states in Europe, a fragile, often fractious creation, but one whose roots lay in the vows she exchanged with her former foe. And from this corner of Eastern Europe, the pattern repeats in another land entirely, where the clash was not between Christian and pagan, but between Hindu warrior clans in an expanding Muslim empire. Mariam-uz-Zamani, better known as Jodhabai, would walk into the Mughal court as the daughter of a defeated Rajput ruler, her marriage to Emperor Akbar a symbol of both submission and survival. Mariam-uz-Zamani, Jodha-Bai. In the middle of the 16th century, the Indian subcontinent was a quilt of kingdoms, some stitched together by loyalty, others barely held in place by the weight of their own rivalries. Among the most formidable forces on the land was the Mughal Empire, newly stabilized under Emperor Akbar, who had inherited not just the imperial throne, but the unfinished work of conquering a land so vast that it could never be taken by the sword alone. It was into this world that Hyra Kunwari, the princess of Amer in Rajputana, was born. She would later be known to history as Mariam-uz-Zamani, Mary of the Age, but at birth she was the daughter of Raja Barmal, a ruler of the Kachwaha clan. The Rajputs were fiercely independent, martial Hindus who measured their prestige not only by the lands they held, but by the wars they had fought to keep them. Amer, Strategically placed in the Aravalli Hills, was a tempting prize for any empire, and Akbar had both the means and the will to claim it. In 1562, the Mughal armies were pressing deep into Rajput territory. Some Rajput states had been crushed outright, others bent into submission through heavy tribute. Amer's ruler, faced with the choice between destruction and accommodation, chose the latter. A treaty was struck, and at its heart was a marriage. His daughter would wed the Mughal emperor. This was not a courtly romance between distant equals, it was the formal union of victor and vanquished. For Akbar, the marriage was more than the spoils of war. He had begun to see that ruling India required more than endless campaigns. Incorporating the Rajputs into his administration would give the empire a warrior aristocracy loyal to the throne, not constantly plotting rebellion in the hills. For Barmal, giving his daughter to Akbar was a way to secure Amer's survival and ensure that his clan would retain its lands under Mughal overlordship. The journey from Amer to the Mughal court must have been both dazzling and disorienting for the young bride. She was stepping into a realm of Persianate refinement, grand palaces, intricate etiquette, a court where the spoken language was a mix of Persian, Turkish, and Hindustani, none of which were her mother tongue. She was also stepping into a Muslim household as a Hindu princess, an outsider in faith, custom, and politics. Akbar, to his credit, did not force her conversion. She remained Hindu throughout her life, continuing her own religious practices even as she took on the title Mariam-uz-Zamani. This was not mere indulgence, it was a deliberate political signal. By allowing his Hindu queen to keep her faith, Akbar made a statement to other Rajput rulers. Their identities could survive within the Mughal order as long as they bent the knee. It was a calculated blend of tolerance and supremacy. Within the Zenana, the imperial women's quarters, Mariam-uz-Zamani carved out an unusually prominent role for herself. She became one of Akbar's chief wives and, in 1569, gave birth to the emperor's eldest surviving son, Salim, later Emperor Jahangir. This cemented her position at court, not merely as a consort but as the mother of the heir apparent. In the intricate hierarchy of Mughal politics, producing the heir was a trump card few could play. Her influence extended beyond the personal. She is recorded as having her own ships for trade, dealing in goods between India and the Persian Gulf, a rare example of a royal woman in early modern India engaging directly in commerce. This economic independence, coupled with her political position, made her one of the most powerful women in Akbar's court. Yet her marriage was always underpinned by the reality of its origins. It was born from conquest. Amer's loyalty to the Mughals was not absolute, and Rajput rebellions flared during Akbar's reign. Mariam-uz-Zamani's role in such moments was inherently double-edged. She could serve as a bridge between her birth family and her husband's empire, smoothing over tensions, or she could be suspected by both sides of divided loyalties. The fact that she maintained her standing through decades of such political volatility speaks to her skill in navigating the crosscurrents of Mughal-Rajput relations. One of the more revealing aspects of her life is how she functioned as a cultural link. Through her, Rajput customs and aesthetics seeped into the Mughal court, in dress, in jewelry, in art. The hybrid styles that emerged under Akbar marrying Persian forms to Rajput motifs were part of the visual language of a new imperial identity, one that could claim to represent the subcontinent as a whole rather than just its Muslim elite. When Akbar died in 1605 and her son Jahangir took the throne, Mariam-uz-Zamani retained her prominence. She became Dowager Empress, a position that allowed her to continue wielding influence, particularly in matters concerning her extended Rajput kin. Her relationship with Jahangir was close, though he too faced rebellions from some Rajput quarters, a reminder that the marriage which had symbolized Mughal-Rajput unity had never truly erased the old antagonisms. Mariam-uz-Zamani died in 1623 after more than 60 years in the Mughal court. She was buried in Agra, in a tomb of red sandstone unadorned compared to the marble wonders her descendants would commission, yet solid, enduring, and quietly authoritative. Her life was a testament to the possibilities and the limitations of political marriage. She had brought her people into the orbit of one of the greatest empires of the age, secured her clan's survival, and shaped the culture of a court that was itself shaping a continent. But her marriage did not end the conflict between the Mughals and the Rajputs. It redefined it. The battlefield shifted from open war to the subtler arena of court politics, where loyalty was bargained for in titles, land grants, and ceremonial honor. The Rajputs remained both pillars of the Mughal order and its most dangerous challengers, a contradiction that would outlive Mariam-uz-Zamani herself. Her story, with its blend of coercion, pragmatism, and adaptation, mirrors another queen's tale in a different corner of Asia. Razia Sultana of Delhi. Razia would also marry across enemy lines, but in her case, the enemy was not a foreign conqueror. It was a rebel lord who had once taken up arms against her, and the alliance was as much a bid for survival as it was a gamble for power. Razia Sultana. Razia Sultana's life was a paradox from the start. A woman in the 13th century sitting on the throne of the Delhi Sultanate, ruling in her own name, commanding armies, presiding over court, yet forever surrounded by men who believed her very existence in that role was an insult to the natural order. She was the daughter of Shamsuddin Iltutmish, the third ruler of the Mamluk dynasty in Delhi, a man of exceptional political instincts who saw in Razia a talent and intelligence that far outstripped those of her brothers. When Iltutmish died in 1236, his will named Razia as his successor, but succession in the Sultanate was never a clean matter of wills and coronations. It was a sport played with daggers in the dark. The Turkish nobility, the Chehalgani or 40, scoffed at the idea of a woman on the throne. They installed one of her brothers instead, hoping to keep the levers of power firmly in male hands. That experiment collapsed quickly, and within the year, Razia ascended to the throne. From the outset, she was a ruler determined to govern, not merely to reign. She cast aside the veiled seclusion of the harem, appeared in public unveiled, and dressed in the attire of a man-armor, tunics, the full regalia of a sovereign. She presided over open courts, heard petitions directly, and made decisions without filtering them through male relatives. For the people of Delhi, this was electrifying. For the entrenched Turkish elite, it was a threat. Her reign was marked by reforms and bold appointments. She promoted capable men regardless of their ethnic origin or background, breaking the monopoly of the Chehalgani. One of these men was Malik Altunia, the governor of Bathinda, who had known Razia since their youth. The two shared a rapport, but theirs was not a straightforward alliance. Altunia was a powerful noble, and while he might have admired Razia personally, he was also wary of her political agenda, which put him at odds with the old guard he was supposed to placate. By 1240, the simmering hostility of the Turkish nobles boiled over. A rebellion broke out, and Malik Altunia, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps opportunistically, joined it. He arrested Razia and imprisoned her in Bathinda. For a ruler who had once seemed untouchable, the fall was swift and humiliating. She had been brought low not by a foreign invader, but by the very class she had tried to reform. It was here, in the strange twilight between captivity and freedom, that Razia and Altunia's relationship shifted. The chronicles are murky about the details. Some say they fell in love during her imprisonment, others that they negotiated a pragmatic alliance. What is clear is that Razia agreed to marry him, and that the marriage was less a love match than a calculated move to reclaim power. She could not regain her throne alone. Altunia could not control Delhi without her legitimacy. The marriage was both symbolic and strategic. The Sultana and the rebel lord, once on opposite sides of a prison door, now united in a bid to retake the capital. Together they marched toward Delhi with their combined forces. It should have been the triumphant second act of her reign, but politics, as always, refused to follow the script. By the time they approached the city, another noble, Bahram Shah Razia's half-brother, had secured his position on the throne and rallied the elite to his side. The confrontation was decisive and brutal. Razia and Altunia's army was defeated. They fled, trying to regroup and perhaps raise more troops, but their enemies were relentless. Captured near Kaithal, the pair were executed. Accounts differ on whether they were killed in battle, murdered in captivity, or executed by local forces unwilling to risk the wrath of Bahram Shah. Razia was just 35 years old. Her marriage to Altunia, brief as it was, remains one of the more unusual alliances in medieval history. It was not a union forged in the bright halls of diplomacy, but in the shadow of betrayal. Altunia had been her captor before he became her husband, and their joint venture to reclaim power was born out of necessity, not trust. Theirs was an alliance of former enemies united against a greater rival, one that, for all its boldness, failed to overcome the entrenched interests of the Delhi court. In the centuries that followed, Razia's reign was romanticized in poetry, drama, and folklore. She was remembered as the Lady Sultan, a figure of both fascination and controversy. In these retellings, her marriage to Altunia often becomes a subplot of tragic love, the warrior queen and the repentant rebel meeting a shared fate. But, stripped of romantic gloss, it is a stark illustration of the transactional nature of royal marriages in times of crisis. Even love, or the appearance of it, could be weaponized when the survival of a throne was at stake. Razia's death did not end the turbulence in Delhi. The same factionalism and resistance to reform that had plagued her reign continued to gnaw at the Sultanate for decades. Yet her brief alliance with Altunia demonstrated a dangerous truth to the political establishment. Even enemies could unite when cornered, and such unions, however fleeting, had the potential to shake the foundations of power. Her story hands us directly to another queen whose marriage was also about bridging a chasm between rival empires, but in her case, the chasm was not within a single city's nobility but stretched across the Mediterranean world. Theophanu, a Byzantine princess, would travel west to marry the Holy Roman Emperor Otto II, bringing with her the prestige of Constantinople and the unspoken hope that the old rivalries between East and West could be smoothed into something like cooperation. Theophanu's story begins in Constantinople, in the shimmering heart of the Byzantine Empire, where marble palaces looked out over the Bosporus and the imperial court ran on ceremony so intricate it could feel like theatre. She was born into a world that measured power in both bloodline and performance. The Byzantines were heirs to Rome's legacy and made a point of reminding the rest of Christendom that theirs was the senior empire, the more refined civilization, the keeper of true imperial dignity. Yet even in this gilded setting, Theophanu's destiny was never going to be confined to the city's golden domes. By the 962nd, Constantinople's gaze turned westward toward the rising power of the Holy Roman Empire, ruled by the Ettonian dynasty. Relations between the two empires had always been complicated, rooted in trade and diplomacy, but soured by disputes over who had the right to call themselves Roman Emperor. The Byzantines saw the Ettonians as upstart imitators. The Ettonians saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the imperial idea. The political geography of the Mediterranean made cooperation occasionally necessary, and in the mid-10th century, the two empires found themselves entangled over control of southern Italy. Byzantine territory that was under pressure from the expanding reach of Otto I, Holy Roman Emperor. Instead of letting the conflict spiral into outright war, both sides decided to try a more delicate solution: a marriage alliance. The idea was to bind the Western and Eastern imperial houses together through a union that could ease tensions and perhaps even create a united front against their common Muslim adversaries in Sicily and North Africa. The intended match was not with Otto I himself, but with his heir, Otto II. The Byzantine court initially balked at offering a princess of the reigning Macedonian dynasty. To them, the Ottonians were still semi-barbarian Germans, impressive in battle, but lacking the polish of Constantinople. Negotiations stretched out, with each side haggling over titles, dowries, and the political symbolism of the match. Eventually, Theophanu, related to the imperial family, but not in the direct line of succession, was chosen as the bride. In 972, she travelled west for the wedding. Her arrival in Rome was a spectacle. Chroniclers describe her procession as a flood of silks, gold-threaded gowns, jewelled diadems, and Byzantine attendants whose manners and clothing were the stuff of whispered fascination in the German and Italian courts. To the Ottonians, she was living proof of their empire's rising status. Marrying into Byzantium was a diplomatic coup. To the Byzantines, she was a reminder to the Westerners of the prestige and sophistication they had yet to match. The marriage between Theophanu and Otto II was not a decorative afterthought, it was a cornerstone of imperial policy. By joining their houses, they created a tenuous peace in Italy and signalled to the rest of Europe that the Ottonians could command recognition from Constantinople itself. But alliances born of rivalry are never entirely free of tension. Theophanu arrived with her own entourage, her own customs, and a political sensibility forged in one of the most sophisticated courts in the world. She did not blend seamlessly into the Ottonian model of queenship. She was active in governance almost from the beginning, advising Otto and sometimes acting in his stead when he was away on campaign. Her influence was visible in the adoption of certain Byzantine court practices in the West, more elaborate ceremonial, an increased use of imperial imagery, and a taste for the luxury goods of the Eastern Mediterranean. Theophanu was no passive ornament. She was a political player in her own right, skilled in the art of courtly persuasion and the balancing of competing interests. Otto II's reign was marked by both ambition and setbacks. He sought to expand imperial control in Italy and to assert dominance over rival powers in the region, including the papacy and the Byzantine governors still clinging to their southern Italian holdings. These ambitions led to renewed friction with Constantinople, the very empire Theophanu's marriage had been meant to pacify. The irony could not have been lost on her. She was a bridge between two empires still competing for the same prize. In 983, Otto II died suddenly at the age of 28, leaving Theophanu a widow with a young son, the future Otto III. In a realm where women's political roles were often limited to symbolic presence, she stepped into the regency with decisiveness. For 7 years, she governed as regent for her son, wielding power in her own name and continuing the policies she and Otto had pursued. She defended the empire's frontiers, maintained the balance of power in Italy, and negotiated with both Eastern and Western rulers as an equal. Her regency was not without opposition. Some German nobles resented her foreign origins and Byzantine manner, interpreting her refinement as arrogance and her authority as overreach. Yet she held her ground, often outmaneuvering her critics with the same blend of ceremony and shrewdness she had learned in Constantinople. Theophanu's rule left a deep imprint on the Ottonian court. She infused it with a sense of imperial grandeur that looked beyond Germany's borders, placing the Holy Roman Empire in a broader Mediterranean context. She also left a more personal legacy. Otto III grew up with his mother's cosmopolitan vision, which later inspired his own ambitious, if ultimately impractical, plans for a Christian empire uniting East and West. The marriage that had brought her west did not end the rivalry between the two empires. If anything, it underlined how stubbornly each clung to its claim of imperial primacy. But it did create a generation of cooperation, enough to stave off open war in Italy and allow for a blending of cultural influences that would ripple through European art, politics, and ceremony. When Theophanu died in 991, still in her early 40s, she was buried in Cologne, far from the marble and mosaics of her birthplace. Her life had spanned the full arc of a political marriage between enemies, from the careful diplomacy that arranged her match to the uneasy partnership that followed, to the moment when she alone carried the weight of the realm. And in the centuries-long chain of such alliances, her name links directly to another woman whose marriage to an enemy was meant to solve a regional crisis, in this case, the chronic tensions between the Crusader Principality of Antioch and the Byzantine Empire. Maria of Antioch's wedding to Manuel I Komnenos would be another attempt to turn swords into vows, though the peace it bought would prove just as fragile. Maria of Antioch. Maria of Antioch was born in the mid-12th century into a world defined by crusades, shifting borders, and the uneasy coexistence of Latin and Greek Christian realms. Her father, Constance of Antioch's second husband, Reynald of Chatillon, had carved out his own brand of notoriety in the history of the Crusader states, a restless, ambitious knight whose political instincts veered toward recklessness. Her mother, Constance, was the ruling princess of Antioch, one of the 4 Latin Christian states established in the Levant after the First Crusade. Antioch itself was a frontier principality in every sense. To the south lay the Kingdom of Jerusalem, theoretically its ally, but often a rival for influence. To the east were Muslim powers Zengids, later Ayyubids, always watching for signs of weakness. And to the north and west lay the Byzantine Empire, which claimed overlordship over Antioch and regarded the Latin rulers as, at best, unruly vassals and, at worst, opportunistic squatters. The city's rulers, for their part, were perfectly willing to accept Byzantine help against Muslim armies, but they balked at any real submission. Maria grew up in this crucible of tension, where Latin-Byzantine relations were a permanent diplomatic migraine. The Byzantine emperors had not forgotten that Antioch was once an imperial possession. Several decades before Maria's birth, the Crusaders had promised to return the city to the empire in exchange for aid, but those promises had gone conveniently unfulfilled. By the time she reached marriageable age, relations between Antioch and Constantinople were again strained. Her stepfather, Reynald, had even launched raids against Byzantine Cyprus, deepening the bad blood. When Reynald was captured and imprisoned by Muslim forces, Antioch's position grew precarious. Constance needed allies, and so did the Byzantines. In the 1162nd, Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, one of Byzantium's most energetic and ambitious rulers, saw an opportunity. A marriage between himself and Maria of Antioch would bind Antioch more closely to the empire, create a personal tie between the imperial throne and the Crusader states, and, perhaps most importantly, allow Manuel to exert influence over Latin politics in the Levant without resorting to outright war. Maria was still in her teens when she was sent to Constantinople for the wedding. For a young woman from Antioch, a city shaped by a mix of Frankish, Armenian, and Levantine influences, the Byzantine capital must have been overwhelming. Constantinople was the largest city in Christendom, a place of blinding wealth, ancient traditions, and court rituals choreographed down to the tilt of a head. Manuel himself was no dour bureaucrat. He was a soldier emperor, athletic, confident, and known for his willingness to adopt certain Western customs, which earned him both admiration and suspicion among his own people. The wedding was a union of two Christian worlds that regarded each other with equal parts kinship and condescension. To the Latins, the Byzantines were overly elaborate, effeminate in their love of ceremony, and politically slippery. To the Byzantines, the Latins were blunt instruments, brave in battle, but culturally coarse and prone to dangerous impulsiveness. Maria, by marrying Manuel, became the human bridge between these two halves of Christendom. As empress, she adapted quickly to her new role. Manuel valued her for the political legitimacy she brought in dealing with the Latin West, and she in turn used her position to advocate for Crusader interests at court. Her beauty and poise were praised by contemporary chroniclers, but beauty in Constantinople was never a shield from politics. It was simply another tool to be wielded. Manuel's reign was dominated by his attempt to position Byzantium as the central power in the eastern Mediterranean. His policies toward the Crusader states oscillated between support and control, and Maria's presence likely softened the edges of some of his interventions. Yet the fact that she was Latin-born could also be a liability. To some Byzantine courtiers, she was a foreign interloper whose loyalties were suspect. When Manuel died in 1180, their son Alexius II was still a child, and Maria became regent. Her position was perilous from the start. She relied heavily on a Latin advisor, which deepened mistrust among the Greek elite. Factions formed quickly, and the court seethed with rumors that she favored Latin merchants and knights over her Byzantine subjects. These tensions were not just about cultural prejudice, they were about power and money, as Constantinople was a hub for trade routes coveted by Italian merchants and resented by local guilds. Her regency did not last long. The resentment toward her Latin connections was exploited by her late husband's cousin, Andronikos Komnenos, a charismatic but ruthless noble who returned from exile to save the empire from foreign influence. In 1182, Andronikos staged a coup. The takeover was accompanied by a horrific anti-Latin massacre in Constantinople, where thousands of Western residents were killed. Maria was deposed, imprisoned, and within months executed, strangled on Andronikos' orders. Maria's marriage to Manuel had been intended as a solution to the long-standing tension between Byzantium and the Crusader state. For a while, it succeeded in creating a personal link strong enough to override suspicion and keep Antioch in the Byzantine orbit without open conflict. But the peace it bought was always fragile, dependent on Manuel's charisma and the political balancing act he performed. Once he was gone, the marriage's legacy unraveled quickly, exposing the underlying mistrust between East and West. Her life is a stark example of the limits of royal marriages in a world where enmity is structural, not circumstantial. She had embodied a truce between two halves of Christendom, yet in the end, her foreignness was the very weapon used to destroy her. The peace she represented turned out to be little more than a pause, and when the pause ended, it did so in a wave of violence that left both Byzantium and the Crusader states weaker. And from this world of Mediterranean politics, we move to another island realm, where a queen's marriage to her enemy would mean surrendering not just her freedom, but her very homeland. Constans of Sicily, the last legitimate heir of the Norman kingdom in southern Italy, would wed Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire, the man whose claim to her crown was backed by armies that could take it by force if she refused. Constans of Sicily. Constans of Sicily's life unfolded like the slow tightening of a siege, except the walls under threat were not stone battlements, but her own birthright. She was born in 1154, the posthumous daughter of Roger II, the first king of a unified kingdom of Sicily. This was no mere island realm. The kingdom encompassed the whole of Sicily, the southern third of the Italian peninsula, and exerted influence over parts of North Africa. Its Norman rulers had forged it through a mixture of conquest, diplomacy, and sheer opportunism, blending Latin, Greek, and Arab cultures into a rare patch of stability in the fractious Mediterranean. Constance, the youngest and last surviving legitimate child of the royal line, spent most of her early life far from the center of power. Because she was born late in her father's life and in an already complicated line of succession, she was sent to a convent, a traditional solution for surplus princesses who might otherwise become the rallying point for rival factions. For decades, it seemed she would live out her life in religious seclusion, cloistered from the chaos of Sicilian politics. But Sicilian politics had a way of dragging everyone back into the fray. By the 1182nd, the royal family's male line was dying out. Her nephew William II had no surviving children, and Constance, childless, unmarried, and well into her 30s, suddenly became the kingdom's heir presumptive. It was a stunning reversal. The woman long kept from public life was now the key to the kingdom's future. And as soon as that fact became clear, she was no longer free to choose her fate. The marriage question was urgent. Whoever married Constance would inherit not only her claim, but also the geopolitical headaches that came with ruling Sicily, pressure from the papacy, constant Norman-Arab rivalries in the south, and the ambitions of the Holy Roman Empire to the north. It was Emperor Frederick Barbarossa's son, Henry VI, who emerged as the leading candidate. Henry was young, ambitious, and already maneuvering to expand imperial power into Italy. Marrying Constance would give him a legitimate claim to Sicily, bypassing the need for a long and bloody conquest, though he was perfectly willing to pursue one if necessary. For Constance, the match was less a choice than an ultimatum. Refusal could have meant war, not just against her, but against the fragile kingdom she was about to inherit. In 1186, she married Henry in Milan, a lavish ceremony meant to project unity between North and South, German Emperor and Norman Queen. Behind the pomp, the reality was starker. The last Norman heiress had been handed to the leader of the very power her ancestors had fought to keep at bay. The marriage immediately altered the political balance of the Mediterranean. Pope Urban III, wary of imperial expansion, bristled at the union, fearing that a combined Sicilian Holy Roman realm would encircle the papal state. The Sicilian nobility, accustomed to a degree of independence under their Norman kings, regarded Henry with suspicion. In Constantinople, the Byzantines saw the match as yet another German encroachment into their sphere. Constance herself was now both the prize and the pivot around which all these anxieties revolved. When William II died in 1189, Constance and Henry expected to succeed without challenge. But the Sicilian crown slipped away almost instantly. The nobles, distrustful of German rule, proclaimed Tancred of Lecce, an illegitimate cousin, as king. Tancred had the advantage of being present in Sicily, speaking the language, and promising to maintain the kingdom's independence from imperial control. Constance and Henry suddenly found themselves claimants without a throne. Henry, tied up in imperial affairs in Germany, launched a campaign south in 1191 to press their claim. Constance accompanied him, a visible reminder to Sicilians that she was their rightful queen. The campaign initially met with success, but as Henry pushed deeper into the kingdom, resistance stiffened. In a twist worthy of a political thriller, Constance was captured by Tancred's forces in Salerno. Her capture was a propaganda windfall for Tancred, who paraded her through the streets to prove that the foreign queen could be humbled. Yet Tancred treated her with a degree of respect, perhaps knowing that harming her would bring the full wrath of the empire. She was eventually released under diplomatic pressure from Pope Celestine III, though the Pope's reasons were hardly altruistic. Keeping Constance alive maintained her as a bargaining chip against Henry and against both imperial and Sicilian ambitions. Once free, Constance returned to Henry, and the struggle for Sicily resumed. Tancred's death in 1194 created a power vacuum, and this time Henry moved swiftly. He invaded, took control of Palermo, and crowned himself king. Constance, now heavily pregnant, was crowned queen alongside him, a rare moment of public triumph after years of political whiplash. Later that year, she gave birth to Frederick II in the small town of Jesi, a boy who would grow up to be one of the most remarkable rulers of the Middle Ages. But the marriage between Constance and Henry was not destined for decades of joint rule. Henry died in 1197, leaving Constance as the sole ruler of Sicily and regent for her young son. In her final years, Constance acted decisively to protect her son's inheritance. She severed Sicily's ties to the Holy Roman Empire, securing papal recognition for Frederick's kingship in exchange for acknowledging Sicily as a papal fief. It was a calculated move, designed to keep the imperial court in Germany from dictating Sicilian affairs and to ensure that Frederick would be raised in a distinctly Sicilian and Norman tradition. Constance died in 1198, having outmaneuvered emperors, popes, and rival claimants to secure her son's throne. Her marriage to Henry VI had been forged in the logic of conquest, better to wed the enemy than to be crushed by him. Yet even within that forced union, she managed to retain a measure of agency, using her position to influence the outcome of the struggle over Sicily. Her story passes naturally into that of another woman who found herself at the mercy of political tides far beyond her control. Galla Placidia, the Roman imperial princess who went from captive of the Visigoths to queen of their people. Her marriage yet another chapter in the uneasy blending of conqueror and conquered. Galla Placidia. Galla Placidia was born around 388 into the highest echelon of Roman power, the daughter of Emperor Theodosius I, who had briefly reunited the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire under a single ruler. Her lineage was impeccable. She was the half-sister of Honorius, future emperor of the Western Empire, and Arcadius, future emperor of the Eastern Empire. She was, in other words, Roman royalty of the most unshakable pedigree, raised in the glittering but increasingly fragile world of the late imperial court. By her early 20s, she had already been trained in the art of imperial politics. This meant she understood that her life, her hand in marriage, and even her physical presence were instruments of statecraft. She would eventually discover just how literal that could be when her role shifted from imperial princess to the political hostage and then wife of one of Rome's most famous enemies. The event that changed her fate came in 410 when Rome was sacked by the Visigoths under their king Alaric. This was no ordinary raid, but the first time in nearly 800 years that the city had fallen to a foreign army. The shock reverberated throughout the empire. Galla Placidia was in the city at the time and was taken captive when the Goths withdrew. Alaric died shortly afterward, but his successor, Ataulf, saw value in keeping her alive, not as a mere prisoner, but as a diplomatic prize. Ataulf was no ordinary barbarian warlord. He understood the symbolic weight of having the sister of the Western Roman emperor in his custody. In the dangerous dance of late antiquity politics, a captive of such rank could be used to extract concessions, forge alliances, or lend legitimacy to new political arrangements. Over time, that last possibility became the path he chose. In 414, in the city of Narbonne, Ataulf married Galla Placidia. The wedding was conducted with deliberate ceremony. According to chroniclers, Ataulf wore Roman-style robes, and the feast was staged to blend Gothic and Roman traditions. It was a calculated image, the barbarian king embracing Roman civilization, the Roman princess consenting whether by choice or necessity, to join her fate with his. The marriage was intended to cement an alliance between the Visigoths and the Romans, or at least between Ataulf's faction and Gala's family. For Gala, the situation was complex. She was still, nominally, a hostage. Her freedom was entirely dependent on her husband's goodwill and the shifting fortunes of Gothic politics. Yet, as queen consort of the Visigoths, she had influence, particularly in encouraging closer ties with the Roman world. Chroniclers sympathetic to her claim that she favored integration rather than destruction, urging Ataulf to work with the empire rather than against it. Whether out of conviction or pragmatism, her position was clear. The Visigoths could secure their place not by annihilating Rome, but by becoming part of its legacy. The marriage did not have long to prove itself. In 415, Ataulf was assassinated in a Gothic power struggle. Gala, now widowed and vulnerable, was at the mercy of his successors. The political protection her marriage had afforded evaporated overnight. She was handed over to Constantius, a powerful Roman general serving her half-brother Honorius as part of a negotiated settlement between the Goths and the Western Empire. In a display of imperial realpolitik, Galla Placidia was then compelled to marry Constantius in 417. This second marriage was no more voluntary than the first, but it marked her return to the Roman political sphere. Constantius was made co-emperor, and Galla bore him 2 children, including Valentinian III, who would later become emperor. After Constantius's death in 421, Galla found herself once again at the center of a dangerous political chessboard. She clashed with her brother Honorius and was eventually forced into exile in Constantinople, where she lived under the protection of her nephew, the Eastern Emperor Theodosius II. When Honorius died in 423, the Western throne was seized by a usurper, Joannes. Theodosius saw an opportunity to restore the legitimate line, and Galla was sent west with an eastern army to place her young son Valentinian on the throne, with her as regent. As regent from 425 to 437, Galla Placidia wielded real power. She navigated the increasingly treacherous politics of the late Western Empire, balancing the ambitions of generals, churchmen, and foreign allies. Her policies were often aimed at preserving the empire's fragile stability, though by her time, Rome's decline was irreversible. She maintained careful relations with the Visigoths, now settled in Aquitaine, perhaps drawing on her earlier experience as their queen. Her life was a study in adaptability, twice married to men who represented opposite ends of Rome's relationship with the barbarian world, one a conqueror of the city itself, the other a defender of its crumbling frontiers. Galla navigated both roles without losing her position as a key player in imperial politics. She understood the power of symbols, her survival after the sack of Rome, her marriage to its conqueror, and her eventual return to rule as regent reinforced the idea that the empire, though wounded, still endured. The marriage to Ataulf remains one of the most striking examples of a royal union meant to heal the wounds of war. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the Visigoths might be absorbed into the Roman world not as enemies but as partners. Yet, like so many such arrangements, it depended too heavily on the personal bond between 2 rulers. When Ataulf died, the alliance died with him. Galla Placidia's death in 450 closed the book on one of the most turbulent and improbable lives of late antiquity. She had been a princess, a hostage, a queen of Rome's enemies, an empress, an exile, and a regent. Her marriages were both the result of and the response to conflict, each an attempt, successful or not, to stitch together worlds that seemed destined to clash. From the fading power of Rome, our path turns to the Hellenistic East, where another royal bride was sent to bind up the wounds of war between rival empires. Berenice, a Ptolemaic princess of Egypt, would marry into the Seleucid dynasty to end the Second Syrian War, a peace that, like so many before it, would unravel into betrayal and bloodshed. Berenice was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt in the 3rd century BCE, a world where peace between kingdoms was more often a polite word for temporary ceasefire until the next betrayal. She was the daughter of Ptolemy II Philadelphus and his second wife Arsinoe I, which made her a direct link in one of the most ambitious and incestuous royal houses in history. The Ptolemies, Macedonian Greeks who had taken Egypt in the carve-up after Alexander the Great's death, ruled with a blend of Greek court culture and Egyptian divine kingship. This meant Berenice was raised in an environment of gold, learning, and ceremony, and also in the constant shadow of war. Egypt's primary rival in the eastern Mediterranean was the Seleucid Empire, which stretched from Syria deep into the lands of Mesopotamia. The two powers had already clashed in the First Syrian War, a contest for control over the rich territories of Coel Syria, modern Lebanon, southern Syria, and parts of Israel, Palestine. The Second Syrian War, c. 260–253 BCE, erupted during Berenice's lifetime, driven by the same ambitions as the first. Each dynasty wanted to plant its standard over the trade routes and fertile lands of the Levant. The war was bloody but indecisive, and by 253 BCE both empires were exhausted enough to consider diplomacy. Out of this stalemate emerged the marriage proposal that would define Berenice's life. She would wed Antiochus II Theos, the Seleucid king. In theory, this would end hostilities and bind the two houses together. In reality, it was a masterstroke of Ptolemaic opportunism. Antiochus was already married to Laodice I, a politically powerful queen with deep roots in the Seleucid aristocracy. The marriage to Berenice would require divorcing Laodice, which Antiochus agreed to do under the terms of the peace treaty. For the Ptolemies, this was ideal. Removing Laodice from her position weakened the internal power networks of the Seleucid court, giving Egypt more leverage. For the Seleucids, it was a dangerous concession, but Antiochus may have seen it as the price for ending a costly war and securing Ptolemaic goodwill at least temporarily. Berenice's arrival in Antioch, the Seleucid capital, was as much a political event as a personal union. She was paraded as the guarantor of peace, her dowry likely substantial enough to make even skeptical Seleucid nobles take notice. But while the marriage may have been celebrated in public, in private it placed her in a precarious position. She was the new wife of a king whose first queen was still alive, still influential, and still connected to powerful families. Antiochus's court became a tense stage where two queens, one the symbol of a new alliance, the other the embodiment of the old order, coexisted in mutual suspicion. For a few years, the arrangement seemed to hold. Berenice bore Antiochus at least one son, strengthening her claim to the future of the Seleucid line. But the peace between Egypt and the Seleucid Empire was never more than a brittle truce. Behind the scenes, Laodice remained active, and her faction worked steadily to undermine Berenice's position. The Seleucid court was a nest of competing ambitions, and Berenice, despite her royal status, was an outsider dependent on her husband's continued favor. That favor was not eternal. Around 246 BCE, Antiochus II died under circumstances that remain murky. Ancient sources hint at poisoning, with Laodice often implicated. Whether or not she orchestrated his death, Laodice moved with remarkable speed. She reclaimed her position, proclaimed her son Seleucus II as king, and ordered the elimination of her rival and her rival's child. Berenice's final chapter was swift and brutal. She attempted to claim the throne for her young son, appealing for aid to her brother, Ptolemy III, who had succeeded their father as king of Egypt. But Laodice's faction struck first. Berenice and her son were murdered before Ptolemy's forces could reach them. Their deaths became the immediate cause of the Third Syrian War, also known as the Laodicean War, as Ptolemy III launched an invasion of the Seleucid Empire in retaliation. In this sense, Berenice's marriage to her enemy did not end the cycle of wars between Egypt and Syria, it merely delayed the next one. Worse, her death provided the perfect rallying cry for a resumption of hostilities. The very act that had been meant to seal peace became the spark for renewed bloodshed. Berenice Sira's story is steeped in the brutal logic of Hellenistic diplomacy. She was a peace offering in human form, deployed to secure a treaty that served her father's strategic aims. Yet the fragility of her position, dependent on the whims of a husband, vulnerable to the revenge of a displaced queen, was built into the very structure of the arrangement. In marrying her enemy, she became an agent of her family's foreign policy. But she also stepped into a web of palace intrigue that had already claimed more than one royal life. Her death also underscored the fact that in the world of the successor kingdoms, marriage was rarely the final word in settling disputes. The Ptolemies and Seleucids would continue to fight over Coel Syria for another century, with each war bloodier and more destructive than the last. Berenice's union with Antiochus II is remembered not for the peace it brought, but for the spectacular way it collapsed, dragging two empires back into war and marking her as another casualty of a game she had been born to play but never allowed to win. From this violent Hellenistic theatre, we move to another woman bound to a conqueror, Statira II, daughter of the last Achaemenid king of Persia. Her marriage to Alexander the Great was a spectacle of imperial propaganda, part political statement, part attempt to fuse two worlds that had spent centuries at war. Statira II was born into the fading glory of the Achaemenid Empire, a dynasty that had once ruled from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. She was the daughter of Darius III, the last great king of Persia, who inherited not a vibrant empire at its height, but a vast and fraying realm facing the most dangerous threat it had ever encountered, Alexander of Macedon. By the time Statira was old enough to understand the world around her, the war between her father and Alexander was already underway, and the drumbeats were getting closer. The Achaemenids had centuries of military tradition, sophisticated administration, and immense wealth on their side, but they also had internal divisions and a ruler who came to the throne under less than ideal circumstances. Darius III was not a weak man, but he faced the most skilled general of the age, a young Macedonian king whose combination of charisma, ruthless pragmatism, and tactical brilliance was rewriting the rules of war. Statira's first encounter with Alexander came not in a throne room, but as a consequence of disaster. In 333 BCE, at the Battle of Issus, Alexander's forces smashed the Persian army, and Darius fled the field, leaving behind his family, his mother, wife, and daughters, who were captured. Among those taken was Statira. Ancient sources tell us Alexander treated his royal prisoners with a respect unusual for the time. Statira and her family were housed in comfort, allowed to maintain their royal dignity, and if the propaganda is to be believed, shielded from harm. Alexander was constructing an image for himself, not merely as a conqueror, but as a magnanimous ruler worthy of empire. For several years, Statira lived in this strange state of captivity, her status both elevated and constrained. She was the daughter of a reigning king, and thus a valuable political pawn. She was also effectively part of Alexander's traveling court. The next major turn in her life came after the decisive Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, where Darius III's defeat sealed the fate of the Achaemenid Empire. Darius was eventually murdered by one of his own satraps, leaving Statira without a father, without a kingdom, and without a clear future except as whatever Alexander decided she would be. Alexander's decision was as political as it was personal. In 324 BCE, at the mass wedding ceremony in Susa, he married Statira too, in a lavish spectacle designed to symbolize the union of Macedonian and Persian elites. The event was unprecedented. Alexander and his closest companions married Persian noblewomen in a coordinated display of imperial unity. Statira, as the daughter of the last great king, was the centerpiece of the entire performance. By marrying her, Alexander could claim legitimacy as the rightful heir to both Macedonian and Persian traditions, binding the two empires in his own person. It's unclear whether Statira had any agency in the matter. Her role was to embody the fusion of two worlds that had spent centuries at war. For Alexander, the marriage was less about romance than about optics. He was trying to integrate the Persian aristocracy into his administration, winning over powerful families and presenting himself as the natural successor to Achaemenid authority. Statira's bloodline made her the perfect symbol of that goal. Life as Alexander's queen must have been both dazzling and precarious. She was surrounded by luxury jewels, silks, and the endless ceremonies of an imperial court, but she was also at the heart of a volatile political experiment. Many Macedonians resented Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, and some Persians saw his overtures as hollow gestures that could never undo the violence of his conquest. Statira's position depended entirely on Alexander's survival and his ability to maintain control over the empire. That dependence was shattered in 323 BCE when Alexander died suddenly in Babylon. His death left a power vacuum so vast it would never be filled. The generals who had once followed him into battle now turned on each other in the wars of the Diadochi, carving up the empire in bloody campaigns. Statira, still in her 20s and without a protector, became a dangerous prize. Whoever controlled her could claim a connection to Alexander and, through her, to both the Macedonian and Persian royal lines. In this chaos, intrigue turned deadly. Roxana, another of Alexander's wives, and the one who was pregnant with his posthumous child, saw Statira as a direct threat to her own position. Ancient sources allege that Roxana invited Statira and her sister Drypetes to a meeting under the guise of reconciliation, only to have them murdered. The bodies were quietly disposed of, and with their deaths, a potential rival claim to Alexander's legacy was erased. Statira's end was brutal and politically calculated, but it was also emblematic of the fragility of her position from the very beginning. Her marriage had been designed to bridge an empire, but it outlived its architect by less than a year. Without Alexander's protection, the symbolism that had once elevated her now marked her for elimination. The tragedy of Statira too lies in the gap between what her marriage was supposed to represent and what it actually achieved. On paper, it was the union of East and West, the blending of two royal houses to create a single, harmonious realm. In reality, it was a brief interlude in a narrative dominated by conquest, mistrust, and factional violence. The fusion Alexander dreamed of died with him, and Statira was one of its first casualties. Her story naturally leads to another woman who married Alexander under similar circumstances, but with a different origin and symbolism: Roxana herself. A Sogdian noblewoman captured during Alexander's Central Asian campaigns, she went from being part of a defeated people to queen of an empire, her marriage both a political gesture and a personal gamble in the shadow of war. Roxana's life is one of those rare stories in history where a single meeting changes everything, not because of fate in the romantic sense, but because in the hard calculus of empire, she was too valuable to remain anonymous. She was the daughter of a Sogdian noble, likely from one of the ruling families in the rugged lands of Bactria Sogdiana. in what is now parts of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan. Her people had faced Alexander the Great's relentless campaigns in Central Asia, not as passive subjects, but as fierce resistors, fighting from mountain strongholds that had frustrated his armies for years. The Sogdian resistance was not simply a matter of pride, it was survival. Alexander's arrival meant the dismantling of local autonomy, the imposition of foreign garrisons, and the redirection of trade routes that had sustained their wealth for centuries. Roxana grew up in this climate of defiance, her family part of the local elite determined to keep the Macedonian invader at bay. But in 327 BCE, the tide turned. The fortress of Sogdian Rock, long considered impregnable, fell to Alexander's forces through a daring assault. Accounts differ on exactly how Roxana came to Alexander's attention. The romanticized version, recorded by some ancient sources, claims he was immediately struck by her beauty when she was brought before him after the fortress fell. She is described as the most beautiful woman in Asia, though such phrases in ancient histories often serve more as narrative shorthand than as literal truth. What mattered politically was that she was the daughter of a prominent Sogdian leader. Marrying her would send a powerful message. The conqueror was now the protector and partner of his former enemies. The marriage was arranged soon after the fall of the fortress, an unusual move for Alexander. He had taken many mistresses and temporary companions on his campaigns, but marriage was rare. By wedding Roxana in 327 BCE, he bound himself to one of the most resistant peoples of his new empire. It was an act of political theatre as much as personal choice, a gesture meant to pacify the Sogdian and Bactrian elites by integrating them into his expanding imperial family. For Roxana, the change was seismic. One moment she was the daughter of a noble in a besieged province, the next she was the wife of the most powerful man in the known world. The wedding itself was conducted according to local customs, rather than purely Macedonian ones, a subtle but significant signal to the conquered peoples that their traditions would have a place in Alexander's empire. Whether this choice reflected Alexander's genuine respect for her culture or simply his shrewdness as a ruler is a question the sources cannot answer. As queen, Roxana accompanied Alexander on the final leg of his conquests, traveling through India and back toward Babylon. She lived in a world of endless marches, military encampments, and the shifting hierarchies of a court made mobile by war. Her position was secure only so long as she retained Alexander's favor, and even then, it was shadowed by the presence of other women who could claim his attention. By the time Alexander staged the mass wedding at Susa in 324 BCE, taking Statira II as another wife, Roxana's position became more precarious. Statira's royal Persian bloodline made her an ideal political consort, the kind of union that could legitimize Alexander's rule over the old Achaemenid territories. Roxana, though noble, did not have such dynastic weight behind her. Ancient accounts suggest she reacted to this rivalry with lethal decisiveness after Alexander's death. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, Roxana was pregnant. This fact instantly made her a central figure in the chaos that followed. The Macedonian generals, the Diadochi, saw her unborn child as a potential heir and therefore as a political asset or a threat. In the scramble for control of the empire, Roxana understood that Statira II's survival would undermine her own child's claim. The sources claim she had Statira and her sister Drypetis murdered, eliminating them as rivals and consolidating her position as the mother of the only direct heir. That heir, Alexander IV, was born posthumously and recognized at least on paper as king alongside Alexander's half-brother Philip III Aridaeus. But the reality was grim. Roxana and her son were pawns in the hands of whichever general held power at any given moment. She was shuffled from one protector to another, never free, always under guard. For over a decade, Roxana endured this gilded captivity as the wars of the Diadochi tore Alexander's empire apart. Every general who claimed to act in the name of Alexander IV was also preparing, quietly or openly, for the day when the boy's claim could be removed entirely. By 310 BCE, Cassander, one of the most ruthless of the successors, took decisive action. He had Roxana and her teenage son executed, erasing the last direct link to Alexander's bloodline and clearing the way for his own dominance in Macedonia. Roxana's life was a sequence of transformations, each dictated by the shifting logic of conquest. She went from enemy noblewoman to imperial queen, from political partner to widow, from mother of a king to a prisoner, and finally to a casualty of the very politics her marriage had been meant to stabilize. Her story shows the paradox of these unions between conqueror and conquered. They could raise a woman to extraordinary heights, but those heights were built on foundations of sand. If Alexander had lived, Roxana might have remained secure as his favored wife, her Sogdian heritage, a bridge between Central Asia and the Macedonian heartlands. In his absence, her foreign origins and her son's royal blood combined to make her too dangerous to be left alive. From the mountains of Sogdiana and the fractured empire of Alexander, the thread of royal marriages to enemies now leads us to the 18th century, where another young woman was sent into the arms of a traditional foe. Marie Antoinette, an Austrian archduchess, would be married to the future king of France, not to end a war already raging, but to prevent one, in a diplomatic gamble that would later be swallowed by revolution. Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was born in 1755-inch Vienna's Hofburg Palace, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Emperor Francis I. She was a Habsburg archduchess, the product of one of Europe's most formidable dynasties, whose long rivalry with France had spanned generations. For centuries, the Habsburgs and the Bourbons had been locked in a cold, then hot, then Cold War over territory, influence, and prestige, fighting in Italy, clashing in the Low Countries, and facing off in the War of the Spanish Succession. The antagonism had become so ingrained in European politics that Austria versus France was practically shorthand for the natural order of things. By the time Marie Antoinette was born, however, the map of alliances was undergoing one of those strange continental inversions that made sense only to the diplomats who engineered them. In 1756, the so-called diplomatic revolution had seen Austria and France, bitter enemies, switch sides. Maria Theresa, still smarting from the loss of Silesia to Prussia in the War of the Austrian Succession, sought to secure her realm by allying with France against their mutual enemy, Frederick the Great. This realignment was sealed in part through a marriage pact. One of Maria Theresa's daughters would wed the Dauphin of France, heir to King Louis XV. That chosen daughter was Marie Antoinette. At the time, she was a lively but not particularly well-educated girl. Her schooling had been haphazard, her handwriting careless, her grasp of French uneven. What she did have was youth, beauty, and the ability to charm, qualities her mother believed could be polished into the tools of diplomacy. In 1770, at the age of 14, Marie Antoinette was married by proxy to the 15-year-old Dauphin, Louis Auguste, in Vienna. Soon afterward, she travelled to France for the official wedding at Versailles, where she was received as the living embodiment of the Franco-Austrian alliance. Her arrival was both a spectacle and a gamble. Versailles was a court obsessed with etiquette and appearances, and every gesture Marie Antoinette made was read as a reflection of the new alliance. The French public, however, did not greet her with unqualified enthusiasm. Many still harboured suspicion of Austria, recalling generations of war and rivalry. Pamphleteers and gossips referred to her as the Austrian woman, implying that she was in France not for love or loyalty, but to serve Habsburg interests. Life at Versailles was a performance without intermission, and Marie Antoinette stepped into her role with mixed success. She was charming in private conversation, vivacious at balls, and adept at winning over friends, but she chafed at the rigid ceremonial life of the court. Her marriage to Louis Auguste was initially a source of awkwardness. The couple failed to consummate their union for years, leading to speculation and ridicule both at court and in diplomatic circles. This delay undermined her political position without an heir. She was vulnerable to whispers that she might be replaced. When Louis XV died in 1774 and her husband became Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette became Queen of France at just 19. As queen, she began to seek more independence, surrounding herself with a small circle of trusted companions. She favored private gatherings over the public rituals of Versailles, retreating to the Petit Trianon, a small chateau where she could live with fewer constraints. To her critics, these retreats looked like arrogance, an unwillingness to fulfill her public role. Over time, her spending habits, often exaggerated but rooted in her love of fashion, theatre, and interior design, became ammunition for her enemies. France's financial problems, caused largely by decades of war and poor fiscal management, were laid at her feet in the popular imagination. The same political logic that had made her marriage a tool of peace now made her an easy scapegoat in times of unrest. She was foreign, she was glamorous, and she could be blamed without consequence. The irony was sharp. The marriage that had been arranged to prevent war between France and Austria had succeeded in that narrow aim, at least for a time. But the union could not shield either monarchy from the rising tide of revolution. By the late 1782, France was in a deepening crisis, with bread shortages, soaring debt, and growing anger at aristocratic privilege. Marie Antoinette's Austrian origins became a central feature of the revolutionary propaganda against her. She was painted as an outsider, a parasite, even a traitor accused, falsely, of conspiring with Austria to undermine the French people. In 1789, the storm broke. The French Revolution transformed the monarchy from a divine institution into a political liability. The royal family was forced from Versailles to Paris under the watch of revolutionary guards. Marie Antoinette's position shifted from queen to prisoner, her every move scrutinized, her every letter suspected of treachery. In 1791, the family attempted to escape to the Austrian Netherlands in the ill-fated flight to Varennes. Their capture and return to Paris only deepened the sense that she was working against the revolution in concert with her Habsburg relatives. The fall of the monarchy in 1792 sealed her fate. Louis XVI was executed in January 1793, and Marie Antoinette, now the widow Capet in revolutionary terminology, was left to face her enemies alone. Her trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal was a foregone conclusion. She was accused of everything from financial corruption to incest, charges designed less to prove truth than to destroy her morally and politically. She was found guilty and executed by guillotine on the 16th of October, 1793, at the age of 37. In the end, Marie Antoinette's marriage to Louis XVI embodied the paradox of dynastic unions between former enemies. On paper, it was a triumph of diplomacy. Two great houses, ending a centuries-long rivalry through matrimony. In practice, it left her caught between loyalties, distrusted in her adopted country, and increasingly irrelevant to the country of her birth. She was a bridge between two monarchies, but when both began to crumble, the bridge was the first thing to be destroyed. And from the gilded halls of Versailles, we cross back into the early medieval world, where another royal bride was sent to bind enemies into allies. Gisela of Bavaria's marriage to Stephen I of Hungary was meant to heal the wounds between the Germans and the Magyars, peoples who had been fierce foes on the battlefield but would, through her union, begin to shape a shared Christian kingdom. Gisela of Bavaria. Gisela of Bavaria was born in the late 10th century into a Europe still defining its borders and identities, a place where war was often the first form of diplomacy and peace was a fragile second act. She was the daughter of Henry II, Duke of Bavaria, a man deeply woven into the politics of the Holy Roman Empire and part of the Ottonian imperial family, an aristocratic network that liked to see itself as the organizing principle of Christian Europe. The Bavarian court into which Gisela was born had long been on the front line of a centuries-old antagonism, the German-speaking peoples of the empire versus the Magyars of the Hungarian plain. The Magyars, arriving in the Carpathian Basin in the late 9th century, had raided far into Western Europe during their early decades, burning towns, seizing loot, and taking captives back east. For much of the 10th century, Hungarian was a byword for mounted terror. But by Gisela's time, the Magyar raids had largely ended, especially after their defeat at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 by her great-uncle Otto I. That victory had forced the Magyars into a more settled existence, but it had not erased the hostility. German and Hungarian relations remained tense, and the borders between them were not clearly drawn in either geography or culture. It was into this still suspicious climate that Gisela's marriage was arranged. Her bridegroom was Vask, the Grand Prince of the Hungarians, who had been baptized into Christianity under the name Stephen. Stephen was no ordinary chieftain. He had embraced Christianity as a state-building tool, aiming to replace the loose tribal confederation of the Magyars with a centralized Christian monarchy that could take its place alongside the kingdoms of the West. Stephen needed a marriage that would reinforce this transformation. A bride from the Bavarian and Ottonian circles would do more than provide personal companionship. It would anchor Hungary in the Christian diplomatic order. For Gisela's family, the marriage was equally strategic. Tying Bavaria's interests to Hungary's rising Christian kingdom would create a buffer zone against future instability in the east. The days when Magyars were the horsemen of doom could be traded for a future where they were trading partners, military allies, and co-defenders of Christendom. The union took place around 995, though the exact date remains murky in medieval sources. Gisela left the familiar rhythms of Bavarian life, cathedrals, imperial courts, the Danube towns she had known since childhood, and entered the more fluid, partly pagan, partly Christian landscape of Hungary. The journey itself was a symbolic act. The daughter of a former enemy crossing the frontier, not with an army, but with a bridal train. As queen, Gisela became an active partner in Stephen's Christianization project. Contemporary and later chronicles describe her as a patron of the church, a builder of monasteries, and a supporter of missionary work. She brought with her not only a retinue of clerics, craftsmen, and advisors from Bavaria, but also the habits of governance she had learned in the imperial world, formal record-keeping, ecclesiastical organization, and the subtle politics of balancing noble factions. This was no easy task. The Christianization of Hungary was not simply a matter of mass baptisms and church building, it was a cultural revolution that met with resistance from the old tribal aristocracy. For every chieftain who saw advantage in aligning with Christian Europe, there was another who viewed the new order as a betrayal of Magyar identity. Stephen faced uprisings throughout his reign, and Gisela, as the foreign queen, was an obvious target for suspicion. Yet she also became a bridge between her birth family and her adopted people. Her Bavarian origin gave her influence with the Holy Roman Emperor, while her role as queen tied her fate to Hungary's survival. This balancing act was crucial when Stephen sought to secure papal recognition of his kingship. According to tradition, Pope Sylvester II sent Stephen a crown, a gesture that was as much about recognizing Gisela's legitimacy as queen as it was about Stephen's own status. The marriage produced children, though tragedy struck early. Their only known son to survive into adulthood, Emmerich, was groomed to inherit the throne but died in a hunting accident around 1031. His death left Stephen without a clear heir, and succession disputes began to simmer, drawing in foreign powers and rival Hungarian factions. After Stephen's death in 1038, Hungary entered a period of instability. Gisela's position weakened as rival claimants, some pagan, some Christian, vied for control. She returned to Bavaria for a time, possibly under duress, and lived in the Benedictine convent of Niedernburg in Passau. There she became abbess, her life turning from politics to religious leadership, though even in the cloister her reputation as a queen endured. Medieval tradition later elevated Gisela to near sainthood, portraying her as a model Christian queen who had helped transform Hungary from a feared pagan realm into a Christian kingdom. While such portrayals often sand away the rough edges of history, the core truth remains. Her marriage to Stephen was a calculated union between former enemies that reshaped Central Europe's political and cultural map. The peace it forged was not unshakable Hungary, and the empire would have their disputes in the centuries to come, but it shifted the relationship from that of raider and victim to that of neighbor and sometimes ally. In the process, Gisela became both a symbol and an architect of Hungary's new identity. From the plains of medieval Hungary, our path winds back to the late 5th century, when another princess married into an enemy kingdom not to Christianize it, but to survive the fracturing of her own people. Saint Clotilde, a Burgundian princess, would wed Clovis I, king of the Franks, their union fusing two rival houses and, in time, helping to lay the foundations of a new political order in Gaul. Saint Clotilde. Clotilde's story begins not in the grand courts of an empire, but in the unstable patchwork of kingdoms that emerged from the wreckage of Roman Gaul. Born around 474, she was a Burgundian princess at a time when the Burgundian kingdom was both a formidable power and a perpetual target. Her father, Chilperic II, was one of several Burgundian kings ruling jointly over a divided realm. The Burgundians themselves had once been Rome's foederati, federated allies settled in southeastern Gaul to guard imperial frontiers. But by the time of Clotilde's birth, the Roman Empire in the west had collapsed, and the Burgundians were playing the dangerous game of survival among rival Germanic kingdoms. Clotilde's childhood was marked by political violence. Her father was murdered during one of the internal power struggles that plagued the Burgundian royal family, reportedly on the orders of his brother Gundobad, who seized the throne. Her mother was exiled, and Clotilde and her sister were spared, but kept under a kind of political watch. In this world, being a royal daughter meant living under constant calculation. Every move, every potential marriage was a matter of statecraft. The Franks, under their ambitious young king Clovis I, were one of the Burgundians' chief rivals. Clovis had already begun uniting the Salian and Ripuarian Franks under his banner and was expanding his power into northern Gaul. His ambitions inevitably brought him into contact and conflict with neighbouring kingdoms, including the Burgundians. It is in this tense atmosphere that Clotilde's marriage was arranged. Accounts differ on whether Clovis sought her hand out of love, strategy, or both, but the political value of the match is obvious. Marrying a Burgundian princess could create a personal link between the two kingdoms, temper hostilities, and perhaps give Clovis leverage over Burgundian affairs. For Gundobad, allowing his niece to marry the Frankish king might buy temporary peace, or at least delay a war. Clotilde was a devout Catholic Christian at a time when most of the Frankish elite were still pagan or Arian Christian, This religious difference would become the most famous aspect of her legacy. When she married Clovis around 492, she brought with her not only the prestige of her lineage, but also the missionary zeal of a queen determined to convert her husband. The marriage began with tragedy. Their first child, baptized into the Catholic faith at Clotilda's insistence, died soon afterward. Clovis blamed the baptism, accusing her religion of weakness. Their second child, also baptized, survived, though not without illness, which softened Clovis's resistance to her beliefs, but did not convert him outright. Clotilde persisted. She played a long game, combining persuasion with patience. Her opportunity came during the Battle of Tolbiac, circa 496, when the Franks were struggling against the Alemanni. Facing defeat, Clovis reportedly prayed to the Christian god that Clotilde had urged him to acknowledge, promising to convert if granted victory. The Franks turned the tide, and true to his vow, Clovis was baptized in Reims by Bishop Remigius in a ceremony that has since been mythologized as the baptism of France itself. This conversion was not just a personal matter, it had seismic political consequences. By adopting Catholic Christianity rather than Arianism, the faith of many other Germanic kings, Clovis aligned himself with the powerful Gallo-Roman Catholic majority in his territories and with the bishops who wielded enormous influence. It also distinguished him from his rivals, making the Franks the Catholic champions of Gaul. Clotilde's role in this transformation, while impossible to quantify precisely, was central in the narrative later promoted by the Church. As queen, Clotilde navigated the politics of a rapidly expanding Frankish kingdom. Clovis's conquests brought the Franks into dominance over much of Gaul, including the eventual subjugation of Burgundy itself. Yet her ties to her birth family remained complicated. After Clovis's death in 511, her sons inherited the kingdom and soon fell into fratricidal conflicts in which Clotilde herself sometimes took sides, seeking to avenge old wrongs and secure power for her branch of the family. The most notorious of these episodes was her involvement in the downfall of her cousin Sigismund, King of Burgundy. Chroniclers suggest she urged her sons to act against him, framing it as retribution for the murder of her parents decades earlier. Whether motivated by justice, vengeance, or pure politics, her actions contributed to Burgundy's eventual absorption into the Frankish realm. Clotilde's later years were marked by disillusionment. She retired to Tours, near the shrine of Saint Martin, living a life of piety and prayer. Her sons' endless quarrels and bloodshed weighed heavily on her, and she reportedly devoted herself to works of charity, building churches and supporting monasteries. In death, she was remembered as a saint, canonized for her role in converting Clovis and, by extension, the Frankish kingdom. Yet behind the sanctified image is the harder truth. Clotilde's marriage was forged between enemies who had spent decades, even centuries, in shifting cycles of war and alliance. Her union with Clovis did not end the violence between Franks and Burgundians, nor did it eliminate the internecine brutality that characterized both kingdoms. What it did was change the ideological frame of Frankish rule, setting it firmly within the Catholic tradition, a shift that would echo for a millennium. Clotilde's life shows the double edge of marrying an enemy. She gained the throne and the opportunity to influence the religious and political trajectory of an emerging superpower, but she also spent her years surrounded by intrigue, revenge, and bloodshed. Her sainthood is the Church's version of the story. The raw politics beneath it are just as much her legacy. From the blood-soaked fields of early medieval Gaul, our journey now moves into the fractious world of the Merovingian successor states, where another foreign princess would marry into a kingdom divided by religion, ambition, and dynastic rivalry. Brunhilde of Austrasia, a Visigothic princess, would wed a Frankish king in the hope of bridging the gap between her people and their old enemies, only to find herself embroiled in one of the most infamous cycles of vengeance in medieval history. Brunhilde of Austrasia. Brunhilde's story begins in the late 6th century, in the Visigothic kingdom of Hispania. She was the daughter of Athanagild, king of the Visigoths, and grew up in a court where political intrigue was as common as courtly ceremony. The Visigoths, by this time, had ruled much of the Iberian Peninsula for nearly a century. They were warriors, legislators, and opportunists, balancing the Roman heritage they had inherited with the Germanic traditions they had brought from across the Rhine. But Brunhilde's childhood was not just about Visigothic stability, it was lived in the shadow of long-standing hostility between the Visigoths and the Franks to the north. Both powers had clashed over border territories, alliances, and influence, particularly in the region of Septimania. Marriages between the two realms were rare and politically loaded. They could signal a truce or set the stage for betrayal. In 567, the Frankish king Sigebert I of Austrasia, a realm encompassing parts of what are now eastern France, western Germany, and Belgium, sought Brunhilde's hand. Sigebert was one of the sons of Clotaire I, the Merovingian ruler who divided his kingdom among his heirs. At the time, the Frankish realms were not a unified kingdom but a collection of competing territories ruled by brothers and cousins whose relationships alternated between cooperation and open warfare. Sigebert's marriage to a Visigothic princess was an ambitious diplomatic move. It promised a stable southern border and the prestige of uniting two great royal houses. For Brunhilde, this meant leaving the Iberian court for the distant and fractious world of Austrasia. She converted from Arian Christianity common among the Visigoths to Catholicism, aligning herself with the religion of her new subjects and gaining the support of the Frankish clergy. The marriage was celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy, and for a brief moment it seemed the union might actually bridge the divide between the two kingdoms. But if Brunhilde had hoped for peace within her new family, she was sorely mistaken. Sigebert's half-brother, Chilperic I, ruler of Neustria, decided to match his brother's prestige by marrying Brunhilde's sister, Galswintha. That union ended in disaster. Galswintha was murdered almost certainly at the instigation of Chilperic's mistress, Fredegund, who soon became his queen. The killing was not just a personal crime. It was a political affront to Brunhilde, her family, and the Visigothic court. From that moment on, Brunhilde became locked in a bitter blood feud with Fredegund, a rivalry that would dominate Frankish politics for decades. Sigebert supported his wife's demand for justice, and the conflict escalated into open war between the brothers. In 575, Sigebert was assassinated, poisoned, according to chroniclers likely on Fredegund's orders. Brunhilde was captured by Chilperic, but later returned to Austrasia under a negotiated settlement. Widowed and surrounded by hostile relatives, Brunhilde might have been expected to fade quietly into the background. Instead, she became one of the most formidable political figures of her age. Acting as regent for her young son, Childebert II, she navigated the treacherous waters of Merovingian politics with a mixture of ruthlessness and administrative skill. She strengthened royal authority, reformed laws, and sought alliances both within and beyond the Frankish world. Her influence was not universally welcomed. Many Austrasian nobles chafed under her assertive rule, and her Visigothic origins made her an easy target for xenophobic resentment. Yet she maintained her grip on power, marrying her children and grandchildren into strategic alliances and manipulating rivalries among the Frankish kingdoms. Her feud with Fredegund never truly ended. Even after Fredegund's death in 597, their respective factions continued to undermine each other. By the early 7th century, Brunhilde's power was at its peak. She was grandmother and great-grandmother to kings, a veteran of decades of political maneuvering. But the same qualities that had allowed her to survive also bred enemies. When her great-grandson, Sigbert II, inherited the throne as a child, Brunhilde once again took up the regency, only to face rebellion from the Austrasian nobility. The rebellion was led by Clothar II, son of Fredegund, in one of history's grimmest examples of cyclical vengeance. In 613, Clothar captured Brunhilde. Her downfall was swift and merciless. She was accused of orchestrating the deaths of numerous Frankish nobles, including several kings, and was condemned without a fair trial. The execution was staged as both punishment and humiliation. She was tied to a wild horse and dragged to her death, her body torn apart. Chroniclers, many writing from the perspective of her enemies, painted Brunhilde as a scheming, vengeful woman whose ambition knew no bounds. But her record also shows a ruler of exceptional ability, one who understood the mechanics of governance, patronized the church, and tried to strengthen royal authority against fractious nobles. Her marriage to Sigebert had been intended to cement peace between the Franks and Visigoths. Instead, it set in motion one of the most infamous personal and political rivalries of the early medieval period. The irony is hard to miss. Brunhilde entered Frankish politics as the foreign bride who would unite two kingdoms, only to die at the hands of the family she had married into, destroyed by the same web of alliances and vendettas she had spent her life manipulating. From the bloodied courts of the Merovingians, our path now leads eastward to the high mountains and contested frontiers of Asia in the 7th century, where another marriage between historic enemies was arranged not as a prize of conquest, but as a delicate diplomatic offering. Princess Wencheng of the Tang dynasty would be sent to Tibet to marry Emperor Songtsen Gampo, a union meant to pacify the volatile Sino-Tibetan borderlands and project the Tang's vision of a civilized order onto the high plateau. Princess Wencheng. Princess Wencheng's life was shaped by the mountains she would eventually cross, not in the physical sense at first, but in the geopolitical one. She was born in the early 7th century during the Tang dynasty, a time when China was projecting its influence outward in all directions, seeking to bind neighboring peoples into a network of tributary states and allies. The Tang court was a place of glittering ceremony and rigid hierarchy, where even a princess was more a political instrument than an independent agent. The Tibet she would one day travel to was not the Tibet of later centuries, inward-looking and isolated, but a rapidly expanding power under the leadership of Songtsen Gampo. His kingdom, centered on the Yarlung Valley, was consolidating various Tibetan tribes into a unified empire, and his ambitions inevitably clashed with Tang interests in the borderlands. The Sino-Tibetan relationship was volatile raids, skirmishes, and demands for recognition passed back and forth across the mountains like storms. In 634, Songtsen Gampo sent envoys to the Tang court requesting a marriage alliance. In the language of diplomacy, this was framed as a request for a princess. In the language of strategy, it was a bid for legitimacy. Marrying a Tang princess would signal that Tibet was not merely a peripheral kingdom, but an equal partner in the regional order. The Tang initially rebuffed the request, whether out of disdain for Tibet's perceived barbarian status or reluctance to strengthen a potential rival. The court was not ready to grant such an honor. Songtsen Gampo's response was swift and forceful. Tibetan forces launched raids into Tang territory, capturing border fortresses and making it clear that Tibet could not be ignored. The Tang Emperor Taizong weighed his options. Full-scale war across the Himalayas was costly and uncertain. A marriage alliance could turn an aggressive neighbor into a nominal ally. In 641, the decision was made. Princess Wencheng would be sent to marry the Tibetan emperor. For Wencheng, this was not a fairy tale departure, but a political exile dressed in ceremonial finery. She left the Tang capital in a procession that displayed imperial generosity. Fine silks, gold, books, craftsmen, and even agricultural experts were sent with her. a mobile package of Chinese civilization intended to impress and influence her new home. The journey itself was epic, covering thousands of kilometers and crossing some of the most treacherous terrain in the world. Upon her arrival in Lhasa, Wencheng entered a court both foreign and formidable. Songtsen Gampo was already married to at least one other queen, Prakuti Devi, a Nepalese princess, suggesting that he was building his diplomatic network through multiple alliances. Wencheng's role was clear. She was the Tang link in this web, the embodiment of the treaty between two powers that had so recently been enemies. Legend and later Tibetan tradition would attribute to Wencheng a civilizing influence on Tibet. She is credited with introducing Chinese agricultural techniques, medicinal knowledge, and even the art of brewing tea. Most famously, she is said to have brought with her a sacred Buddhist image, which played a role in Tibet's gradual adoption of Buddhism. Whether these details are historically precise or embroidered by later storytelling, they reflect the symbolic weight she carried. She was not only a queen but also a conduit for ideas and cultural exchange. Politically, her marriage coincided with a period of relative peace between Tibet and the Tang. Trade routes stabilized, embassies were exchanged, and the two courts maintained a cautious respect. Yet the alliance was never one of equals in the Tang imagination. In Chinese records, Tibet was still listed among the tributary states, even if Songtsen Gampo saw the arrangement differently. For Wencheng, life in Tibet would have been an exercise in adaptation. The Tang court was regimented and deeply literate, with Confucian bureaucrats managing the machinery of state. The Tibetan court was more militarized and fluid, shaped by tribal loyalties and the ambitions of its ruler. Navigating these differences required diplomatic skill, particularly for a queen whose very presence was a reminder of a foreign power. The peace she helped forge was not permanent. After the deaths of both Songtsen Gampo and Taizong, tensions resumed between their successors, and the Sino-Tibetan frontier remained contested for centuries. Yet Wencheng's marriage had set a precedent. Diplomacy through marriage could work, at least for a time, even between states that had met first on the battlefield. The later romanticization of her story, particularly in Tibetan Buddhist tradition, turned her into a near-mythic figure, a bringer of knowledge, a gentle persuader, a symbol of harmony between China and Tibet. But beneath the legend lies the harder truth. She was sent to her enemy not because of personal choice or affection, but because her departure suited the strategic needs of an empire. The peace she represented was a negotiated pause in a long rivalry, one that depended on the political will of leaders far above her in the hierarchy. Her life encapsulates the paradox of these enemy-to-spouse arrangements. Wencheng left her homeland in the service of peace, and for a time, she succeeded. But she also lived as a perpetual outsider, her identity tied to two worlds that could never entirely trust one another. In her story, we can see the limits of marriage diplomacy. It can shift the tone of a relationship, but it cannot erase the ambitions or suspicions of rival states. From the wind-swept plateau of Tibet, our path turns northeast to the steppes and borderlands of ancient China, where another woman would be sent into marriage with a traditional enemy. Wang Zhaojun, one of the famed four beauties of China, would wed the Chan Yu of the Xiongnu, a union designed to end a generations-long border war and one that would become one of the most celebrated and melancholy tales in Chinese history. Wang Zhaojun. Wang Zhaojun's life unfolded in the tense frontier space between the Han dynasty and the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic tribes whose swift horses and sudden raids had been a constant thorn in China's northern border for generations. Her story begins in the 1st century BCE, during the reign of Emperor Yuan of Han, when the imperial court at Chang'an was both the center of refined culture and the heart of a sprawling bureaucratic machine that viewed its women, especially those in the imperial harem, as assets in the business of diplomacy. She was born in Ba County, in what is now Hubei province, into a modest but respectable family. Like many young women of her time, her beauty and intelligence brought her to the attention of imperial recruiters, and she was selected for the harem. But selected for the harem did not mean an immediate audience with the emperor. The Han court was crowded with hundreds, even thousands of palace women, and access to the ruler's notice was often determined not by merit or charm, but by the treacherous currents of palace politics. Here is where fate and human manipulation intervened. The emperor relied on court painters to create portraits of potential consorts, and these images determined which women would be summoned to his side. Officials were known to accept bribes to flatter a woman's likeness, and Wang Zhaojun, either refusing or unable to bribe the painter Mao Yanshu, was depicted with less than her true beauty. As a result, she spent years in the harem unnoticed, her potential unused, her fate uncertain. Beyond the palace walls, the Han-Xiongnu relationship was at one of its cyclical turning points. Since the reign of Emperor Gaozu, the Han had pursued the Hekin policy, peace through marriage alliances, in which a Han princess, or more accurately, a woman of the imperial clan or court, would be married to the Chanyu, the ruler of the Xiongnu, in exchange for promises of peace, trade, and stability on the frontier. The policy was controversial, seen by some as practical statecraft and by others as humiliating tribute to barbarians. In 33 BCE, the Xiongnu Shanyu Huhanyi came to the Han court to reaffirm his allegiance as a tributary vassal. The Han emperor, adhering to the Hekin tradition, offered him a bride from the imperial household. This was when Wang Zhaojun's overlooked beauty came into play. Whether by design or by chance, she was chosen for the match. When she was summoned to the emperor to be presented to the Chanyu, her true appearance was revealed radiant enough to shock the court. Emperor Yuan is said to have regretted letting such a woman leave, but the political machinery was already in motion. To withdraw her would have been a breach of diplomatic protocol, and so the marriage went ahead. Mao Yanshu, the painter who had misrepresented her, was executed, an act that served as both imperial vengeance and a warning to courtiers about the dangers of deceit. Wang Zhaojun's journey to the Xiongnu steppe was more than a personal migration. It was the physical enactment of a treaty. She left the opulent halls of Chang'an for a land of vast skies, harsh winters, and mobile cities of felt tents. There, she became queen to Huhanyi, her marriage a living symbol of the fragile peace between two historically hostile peoples. Sources describe her as adapting well to her new life, earning the respect of the Xiongnu court and strengthening the bonds between her birth country and her adopted one. She bore Huhanyi children, embedding herself in the royal line and, by extension, the political future of the Xiongnu Confederation. Her influence was less about direct governance and more about sustaining the goodwill that her marriage had inaugurated. But peace was never permanent on the steppe. After Huhanyi's death, Wang Zhaojun was expected, according to Xiongnu levirate custom, to marry his successor, possibly his son or another close male relative. Han Chinese sources record her reluctance, presenting this as a cultural and moral shock for a woman raised under Confucian norms, which strictly forbade a woman from marrying her husband's kin. Nonetheless, she complied, not out of personal desire, but as a continuation of her political role. Her life after this point becomes harder to trace with certainty. Some records suggest she remained among the Xiongnu until her death, her children becoming important figures in the Confederation. Others romanticize her story into a tragic ballad of homesickness and sacrifice, emphasizing her longing for the South and the civilization she had left behind. Over centuries, poets and storytellers turned her into a symbol of the woman who went beyond the frontier for the sake of peace, her image mingling reality with legend. What is clear is that her marriage succeeded, for a time, in stabilizing the northern frontier. The Han and the Xiongnu enjoyed a period of reduced hostilities and increased trade, and Wang Zhaojun's presence at the Xiongnu court was a daily reminder of the treaty that bound the two powers. Yet the peace did not last beyond the generation that made it. When her sons and stepsons came to power, the old cycles of alliance and conflict resumed, proving once again that marital diplomacy could soften, but not erase, the hard edges of geopolitical rivalry. In the centuries that followed, her story became one of the great romantic tragedies of Chinese history, enshrined in poetry, opera, and painting. The historical Wang Zhaojun was a political envoy, a woman who left her homeland for a foreign court because her emperor willed it. The legendary Zhao Jun was the fallen goose so beautiful that her presence startled a migrating flock into breaking formation, a woman whose beauty and grace were matched only by her sorrow. Both versions, historical and poetic, speak to the same truth. She was a living sacrifice to the idea of peace, her life given over to the service of a political relationship that could never fully shed the memory of war. From the windswept steppe where Wang Zhaojun's story ends, we move south to the tropical coasts of Southeast Asia in the early 14th century, where another princess was given in marriage to a long-time adversary. The Huyen Tran princess of Dai Viet would wed the king of Champa, a union born from war, paid for in territory, and remembered in both countries as a marriage wrapped in uneasy gratitude and suspicion. Huyen Tran, princess of Dai Viet. In the early 14th century, Southeast Asia was a tapestry of competing kingdoms, maritime trade routes, and alliances sealed as often by war as by marriage. Dai Viet, located in what is now northern and central Vietnam, was ruled by the Tran dynasty, a line of emperors who had defended their realm against Mongol invasions and expanded their influence southward. To the south lay Champa, a seafaring kingdom whose culture blended Indian, local, and later Islamic influences, and whose history with Dai Viet was defined by alternating periods of conflict and reluctant peace. For centuries, Dai Viet and Champa had been neighbors and adversaries, locked in cycles of raids, counter-raids, and uneasy truces. The frontier between them was not just a border but a zone of contested identity, where trade caravans, pirates, and armies all moved along the same coastal routes. In this climate, any diplomatic overture between the two states carried the weight of decades of bloodshed and mistrust. Huyen Tran, the daughter of Emperor Tran Nhan Tong, was born into the royal court of Thang Long, modern-day Hanoi, a city that was both a seat of political authority and a center of Confucian learning. Her father was a celebrated ruler, remembered for his leadership during the Mongol invasions and for his decision, later in life, to abdicate and take monastic vows. By the time of her adulthood, Huyen Tran was accustomed to the rhythms of court life, where a princess's fate was often decided not by her own wishes, but by the needs of the dynasty. The moment that would define her life came in 1306, under the reign of her brother, Emperor Tran An Tong. The king of Champa, Che Man, sought to solidify peace between his kingdom and Dai Viet, after years of intermittent warfare. His proposal was bold. He would cede 2 provinces, O and Li, to Dai Viet in exchange for Huyen Tran's hand in marriage. These lands lay along the central coast, strategically valuable for both commerce and defense. From the Vietnamese perspective, the deal was extraordinarily advantageous. In exchange for 1 royal marriage, the realm gained territory without bloodshed, an almost unthinkable outcome in the centuries-long contest with Champa. For Huyen Tran, however, the arrangement meant leaving her homeland for a foreign court whose language, customs, and political intrigues would be alien to her. The marriage took place with great ceremony, attended by envoys and dignitaries from both realms. Chroniclers depict it as a moment of hope, a symbolic turning of the page from war to alliance. Yet the underlying reality was more pragmatic. This was a transaction in which a princess was the living seal on a territorial treaty. Her beauty, grace, and noble lineage were part of the currency of peace. Huyen Tran's life in Champa was shaped by her position as both queen and foreigner. As the Vietnamese consort of Che Mun, she was expected to fulfill ceremonial duties, act as a cultural bridge, and perhaps bear heirs who could unite the bloodlines of two rival realms. The Cham court, with its Hindu temples, maritime trade networks, and rich artistic traditions, was a world apart from Confucian Thang Long. Whether she embraced her new life, or endured it with quiet resignation, is a question the sources cannot fully answer. Her marriage lasted barely a year. In 1307, Che Man died suddenly. According to Cham custom, the royal widow was to be immolated alongside her husband in a ritual known as sati, a practice alien and abhorrent to Vietnamese norms. When word reached Dai Viet, Emperor Tran An Tong acted swiftly. He dispatched a trusted general, Tran Kak Chung, to attend the funeral rites, ostensibly as an envoy of mourning. In reality, his mission was to smuggle Huyen Tran out of Champa before the ritual could claim her life. The rescue was carried out under the cover of diplomacy. Tran Kak Chung negotiated with the Cham court, bought time with ceremonial observances, and then spirited the princess away under the pretext of a delayed return journey. According to Vietnamese legend, and to the delight of later romantic imaginations, the escape took over a year, during which the general and the princess fell in love. Whether this was true or a later embellishment is impossible to say, but the tale has ensured that Huyen Tran's story is remembered as both a political drama and a romance. Her return to Dai Viet did not undo the marriage's political effects. The provinces of O and Li remained under Vietnamese control, later becoming part of the historic southward expansion known as Nam Tien. The peace between Dai Viet and Champa, however, was temporary. Within decades, hostilities resumed, and the two kingdoms returned to their pattern of rivalry and war. Huyen Tran's life after her return fades into the quiet of history. Some accounts claim she lived out her days in a Buddhist convent, withdrawing from public life. Others leave her fate entirely unrecorded, as though her role ended the moment the political alliance she symbolized was no longer active. Her marriage is a striking example of the high-stakes diplomacy of her time, a union that brought real, tangible gains to her homeland, but at the cost of her personal freedom and safety. The drama of her near immolation and daring escape ensured her a place in Vietnamese cultural memory, where she is often portrayed as both a heroine and a tragic figure caught between the needs of state and the dictates of her own survival. From the sunlit coasts of Champa, our journey now moves back to the misty frontiers of medieval Britain, where another royal marriage was meant to heal centuries of hostility. Joan of England, daughter of King John, would be wed to Alexander II of Scotland, a union that sought to tame the turbulent Anglo-Scottish border, even as old grievances and new ambitions threatened to pull it apart. Joan of England, 1207-1238. Joan of England was born in 1207 into a realm already riddled with tension, and into a family that knew too well the fine line between alliance and enmity. She was the eldest legitimate daughter of King John of England, yes, that King John, the same who would go down in history as a villain in chronicles and legends alike. Her mother was Isabella of Angoulême, whose marriage to John had caused its own diplomatic storms, not least because it involved breaking an earlier betrothal to a French noble. From the moment of Joan's birth, the Anglo-Scottish frontier was a zone of restless unease. England and Scotland had been locked in cycles of hostility and fragile truces for centuries. Raids across the border were as routine as market days. Kings swore peace one season and took up arms the next. The Treaty of Falaise, the humiliating capture of William the Lion, Richard the Lionheart's costly ransom. These episodes were all within living memory when Joan was a child. By the time she reached marriageable age, diplomacy was moving toward another attempt at a solution, a royal marriage to tame the border. The man chosen for her was Alexander II, King of Scotland. He had come to the throne as a teenager in 1214, inheriting both the crown and his father's grievances against England. In his early reign, Alexander had allied with rebellious English barons against King John, even supporting Prince Louis of France's brief, ill-fated claim to the English throne. But the winds of politics shifted after John's death in 1216, when the 9-year-old Henry III became king under the regency of William Marshal. The Scots withdrew from English territory, and diplomatic overtures replaced military maneuvers. Marriage was the most potent symbolic gesture available, a means of transforming yesterday's enemy into today's in-law. Joan was about 11 when negotiations began in earnest. The agreement was woven into the Treaty of York of 1221, which settled some outstanding border disputes. In June of that year, Joan travelled north, her journey staged with all the pomp necessary to signal goodwill between two crowns that had spent decades tearing at each other's borders. The wedding took place at York Minster. Chroniclers noted the magnificence of the ceremony and the high-ranking guests in attendance, but they were more guarded when it came to the bride's inner life. Joan, still in her early teens, was now queen of a country whose people had seen her father as a mortal foe. Alexander, at 23, was a young but experienced ruler, already accustomed to the responsibilities of kingship and the demands of border politics. The marriage was, in the most literal sense, a peace treaty embodied in flesh. Its aim was to cement Anglo-Scottish cooperation, or at least mutual restraint. In the short term, it worked. The 1222nd saw relative calm along the border, with both kingdoms preoccupied by their own domestic challenges. In Scotland, Alexander consolidated royal authority over rebellious nobles and maintained pressure on the Norse presence in the Hebrides. In England, Henry III's minority government navigated baronial politics and rebuilt royal power after the chaos of John's reign. But Joan's role as queen was less about direct political agency and more about symbolism and ceremony. The Scottish court she entered was smaller and less wealthy than the English one she had left, but it was a centre of its own culture and traditions. Joan's position required her to embody the virtues of queenship: patronage of the church, ceremonial hospitality, and the quiet diplomacy of presence. Her English birth was both her strength and her liability, an emblem of peace to some, a reminder of subordination to others. Her marriage to Alexander, however, produced no children. This absence of an heir was more than a personal sorrow. It was a political vulnerability. Royal marriages were expected to bind kingdoms not just through the wedding ceremony but through the blood of the next generation. Without offspring, the symbolic value of Joan's marriage began to fade. By the mid-1232, Joan's life took a turn toward estrangement. She spent increasing amounts of time in England, visiting her brother Henry III's court. The reasons for this distance from Alexander remain unclear, perhaps personal incompatibility, perhaps political friction, perhaps the simple reality that her marriage had fulfilled its treaty function, but not its dynastic one. In 1238, Joan fell ill while in England. She died at Havering Atte Bower, a royal estate in Essex, and was buried at Tarrant Crawford Abbey in Dorset. Her early death, at around 31, ended a life that had been shaped almost entirely by the political geography of the Anglo-Scottish border. She had gone north as the living embodiment of peace, and while that peace did not last forever, it endured for the length of her marriage, a rare achievement in the history of the two kingdoms' relations. Her story sits in the quiet middle ground between triumph and tragedy. She was not a queen who wielded great political power, nor was she a victim of spectacular misfortune. Instead, she was the kind of figure medieval diplomacy often produced. A young woman whose destiny was to act as the hinge between two states, her personal happiness secondary to the hope that her presence might cool the heat of old rivalries. From the rolling hills and watchtowers of the Anglo-Scottish frontier, we now journey to the sun-baked plains of Iberia, where another marriage between rivals was forged in the hope of ending chronic wars. Berengaria of Castile, a queen in her own right, would wed Alfonso IX of Leon, her kingdom's frequent antagonist, in a union that promised unity but delivered a different kind of political legacy altogether. Berengaria of Castile. Berengaria of Castile's life was steeped in the political rivalries of medieval Iberia, where alliances could turn to open war in the time it took a messenger to cross the mountains. Born in 1179, she was the eldest daughter of King Alfonso VIII of Castile, and Eleanor of England herself, the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II of England. Berengaria thus stood at the crossroads of three great political spheres: Castile, the Plantagenet domains, and the wider network of Christian kingdoms engaged in the long Reconquista against Muslim-ruled Al-Andalus. The Iberian Peninsula in Berengaria's time was not a unified Christian front, but a patchwork of competing kingdoms: Castile, Leon, Aragon, Navarre, each pursuing its own interests, even while professing the common cause of reclaiming territory from Muslim rulers in the south. Rivalries between Christian kings were often as fierce as their campaigns against the Almohad Caliphate, and few rivalries were more enduring than that between Castile and Leon. The two crowns had been joined and separated multiple times through inheritance, marriage, and political fracture, producing a tangled web of claims and counterclaims. In this context, Berengaria's marriage was a calculated gamble. Her intended husband, Alfonso IX of Leon, was not just another monarch, he was a frequent antagonist of her father, with whom he had fought over border territories and influence in Galicia and Extremadura. Their realms had clashed militarily, and their relations alternated between uneasy truces and open hostility. The match was agreed in 1197, and while chroniclers like to frame such unions as peace through matrimony, both parties likely saw it as an opportunity to secure leverage. For Castile, marrying its heiress to the King of Leon promised a reduction in border warfare and the potential for future unification under their offspring. For Alfonso IX, it was a way to legitimize his claims in disputed territories and to anchor his dynasty to the prestige of both Castile and its English royal connections through Berengaria's mother. There was one glaring problem: the couple were closely related. In the medieval world, marriage within the prohibited degrees of kinship required papal dispensation, and in their case, that dispensation had not been properly secured, or at least not in a way the Pope was prepared to acknowledge. The Church's stance on such matters was as much political as it was theological, and in 1204, Pope Innocent III declared the marriage invalid on the grounds of consanguinity. But between their wedding and annulment, Berengaria and Alfonso IX had several children, including the boy who would become Ferdinand III, arguably one of the most important rulers in Iberian history. Ferdinand would later inherit both Castile and Leon, finally uniting the two crowns in a personal union that would endure and lay groundwork for Spain's eventual unification centuries later. Berengaria's role as Queen Consort of Leon was not marked by docile acquiescence. She was intelligent, politically astute, and deeply aware of her position as a bridge and sometimes a barrier between two rival courts. Her time in Leon, though brief, exposed her to the complex internal politics of a kingdom where royal authority had to contend with powerful nobles and the influential Galician church. When the annulment was enforced, Berengaria returned to Castile with her children, retaining custody and thus control over their future political value. This was not a passive withdrawal, it was a strategic repositioning. Back in Castile, she resumed her place in the royal succession line, particularly after the death of her younger brothers. In 1217, when her father's death and her brother Henry I's sudden passing left the throne vacant, Berengaria briefly became Queen Regnant of Castile in her own right. Her reign lasted only a matter of days, not because she was deposed, but because she made a deliberate choice to abdicate in favor of her son Ferdinand. The move was shrewd. By placing her son on the throne while he was still a teenager, she could act as his advisor and regent, consolidating his position and ensuring that her own influence continued. This decision also set the stage for Ferdinand's eventual inheritance of Leon upon Alfonso IX's death, realizing in practice what her marriage had once promised in theory: the unification of two rival kingdoms under a single monarch. The irony, of course, is that the marriage itself did not last long enough to cement peace in the way its architects might have hoped. The annulment removed the formal tie between Castile and Leon, and Alfonso IX's subsequent political maneuvers were not always in harmony with Berengaria's interests. At times, they were outright adversaries again, as the King of Leon formed alliances that challenged Castilian influence. But Berengaria's careful management of her son's position and her control of his upbringing meant that she played the long game more effectively than most medieval queens could hope to. She remained active in politics well into her later years, advising Ferdinand III during his campaigns against Muslim-held territories and in the delicate diplomacy with other Christian kingdoms. Chroniclers praised her wisdom and prudence, and even those who criticized her ambition acknowledged her rare skill in surviving and thriving in the shifting sands of Iberian power. Berengaria died in 1246, by which time her son had been king of both Castile and Leon for over a decade, leading successful campaigns that pushed deep into Andalusian territory. The territorial and political unity she had once embodied as a young bride had finally been achieved, not through the endurance of her marriage, but through her ability to turn its broken pieces into a new political structure. Her marriage to Alfonso IX is a perfect example of the paradox that runs through so many of these unions between former enemies. It was meant to secure immediate peace, and for a brief window, it did. But its ultimate legacy came not from its preservation, but from its dissolution, from the fact that Berengaria could take the children of that alliance, remove them from the marital conflict, and shape them into instruments of a more lasting unification.